a certain note of what do we do next from Mission Control in Houston this morning. I was saying that it took over an hour before the contingency recovery forces, as they were called, were allowed out into the Atlantic because so much debris was falling from the skies, not only the great boosters. At the moment of launch, here is the McAuliffe family watching their daughter go into space. Those are her parents, her father, and her mother. And those, some of the school children with their caps on. Her mother clearly weeping with pride at that point. Those children at the Cape itself, very much like the children who had watched at Krista McAuliffe's school in New Hampshire, as described to us, for minutes did not know what was happening. It looked very much to us as if her parents did not know what was happening for some period of time. John Quinones, ABC's correspondent at the Cape, said to us earlier that in fact many people who were watching at the Cape did not know what was going on. Krista McAuliffe, the first pure civilian, the first teacher in space, with her parents and lots of children in attendance from her school at Cape Canaveral today. 24 space missions had already been accomplished before tragedy occurred on this one. And at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the space agency is going to hold a news conference to try to explain to us what they know. We don't know what they know in terms of what went wrong in this, the world's first reusable spacecraft. ABC's Lynn Scher is standing by with us in Los Angeles. Lynn, what do they look for first? I'm sorry, but what do they look for first?
Well, Peter, I think the first thing they're going to have to do is analyze that tape. They've got to be able to look at it. I assume they will enhance it with a computer, look at it as closely as they can to try to pinpoint where the first flash was, where the explosion took place. I know you've been through this a few times yourself, but here, of course, is the shuttle, the tank with the liquid fuel, the two solid rockets. They need to look and see if, for instance, the explosion began around here, then there was some kind of rupture of the tank with all of its liquid fuel, much of it still left for 6 minutes left of engine power. They need to see if perhaps it started in one of the two solid rockets. These are Roman candles, if you will. They are ignited, they cannot be stopped, they go off, they help it up, and then these two rockets drop off. Question, what happened? Was it in there? A spark, an explosion in one of these, misdirected, might have ignited the tank, and the shuttle simply would not have a chance. The external tank, which is full of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, has a very, very thin skin, and it would rupture extremely easily. The shuttle, which is designed to go into space and to come down and take that enormous heat of re-entry, is nonetheless also very thin-skinned comparatively. So it cannot withstand a major explosion. So I think the first thing they're going to do is analyze that tape. They will also go back over their numbers. I mentioned earlier that they obviously did not see anything at the moment of impact, but they're going to have to go back and see if there was any signal of something about to happen. Beyond that, they have complete records of every single part on the shuttle, on the tank, and on the two boosters. They will now go back and reanalyze every single part, when it was put in, when it was checked, what might have gone wrong. They've got to start there. I don't know where else to go.
Gene, let me ask you, Gene Cernan in Houston, recovery of the artifacts of this shuttle must now be absolutely critical, or can they begin some kind of investigation just based on telemetry and other data?
I think the answer to that is both, Peter. Lynn is exactly right, that there are reams and reams of data, not just from this flight, but from all previous flights which I made. They will go and look for some chronic ailment, something they see occurring over and over again. But certainly every piece that they can recover, that they could put back together, much like an aircraft accident, is going to be very vital to finding out what the real answers are. I don't think anyone can do anything but guess at this point in time. Unfortunately, as we saw the pictures of the explosion, it was so catastrophic that it indeed did consume the entire Challenger spacecraft. And when I saw the pieces
Gene, there
down,
it is again.
We're looking at it now in very slow motion. And when it exploded, it seemed to consume the entire shuttle vehicle itself. And there was no singular piece we could say, there it comes or there it is. So you can get a feeling for the magnitude and the quickness in which that explosion occurred, and literally consumed everything except those two solid rocket boosters, which appeared to be forced or broken away and fly their own path.
Gene, there appears to be on that particular piece of videotape, I'm not sure we can look at it again, a flare, there it is again, a flare right underneath the nose of the Challenger.
I do see it, and of course Lynn is exactly right. She knows the vehicle, and as well as anybody at this point in time, the external tank that carries the very explosive propellants of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen is very thin-skinned, but it's done for a purpose. It doesn't violate safety. It has to be light to allow it to get into space and then burn up during re-entry. It's possible a rupture could have occurred. There is also a barrier between the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen within the tank itself, which is very important because you don't want to mix those two propellants until you mix them appropriately in the rocket engines themselves. See the magnitude. You don't see anything of the shuttle vehicle at all coming out of this explosion, which
there's the shot of the tank on the upper right. Can we roll that tape back just a second there, and we can see again one of the solid fuel rockets going off to the right of your screen there and shooting out of the picture. That, as you say, Gene and or Lynn, just goes off on its own steam.
Well, it goes off now. You know, there is nothing to shut it down. Obviously, it survived the explosion, and it does not have any guidance because the guidance was given to it by the computers on board the shuttle itself. So now it just is aimlessly flying until it descends into the ocean. But it probably, the force of the explosion just blew one or maybe both of those solid rocket boosters away, and they continue to burn. As I said earlier, the solid is sort of like just a solid mass of gunpowder, and once you ignite it, it burns slowly and controlled, but it continued to burn.
And as Lynn was pointing out, there was enough fuel on there, particularly in the main tank, for another 6 minutes of flight. Lynn, is there anything on a shuttle reminiscent or resembling a black box that we get on commercial aircraft?
They have plenty of data that should have...
Lynn,
I'm sorry?
I apologize, not your fault, but John Glenn, among America's most famous astronauts, has appeared to make a statement on Capitol Hill.
Repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. It's been an amazingly successful program so far. I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast-off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ned White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
The loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
How much does it set back the citizen in space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator John Glenn, one of the most famous flyers in this nation's history. It was back in 1962, I think, February 1962, when John Glenn became the first man to actually orbit the globe. Alan Shepard had been the first man into space, you'll recall. All of them. An important strain in the fabric of American adventure. Some of you may recall the movie The Right Stuff. And he sang, perhaps the obvious, with no insult intended, that the day has finally come when the accident occurred. Reflecting what many people have said this morning, including one Congressman Gray from Pennsylvania, who said we had become so accustomed to success in space that we simply were unprepared or ill-prepared for this kind of a tragedy. The Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill's office, has just said a short while ago, which will give you some indication of the impact of this tragedy here in the nation's capital, that the State of the Union message, which the President was due to give this evening at 9 o'clock, is now going to be postponed for a week. We have not heard that officially from the White House, but Larry Speaks, the White House spokesman, is going to give another briefing in about half an hour, and we have, in 1 minute, in fact, and we have also been told by sources at NASA here in Washington that NASA does not plan, as we had told you earlier hearing from Houston, a news conference or a briefing at 3 o'clock. John Glenn has said, as Gene Cernan has said, as Lynn Shure has said, that this is going to require very careful and probably lengthy analysis before we have any sense of what it was that caused this tragedy this morning and cost the lives of 7 Americans seeking the heavens. We are not perfect, said John Glenn, and of course the double impact today is surely because despite all the delays which have occurred with Challenger, but even more so with the Shuttle Columbia, we have become accustomed now to success in space. Wishes of bereavement and condolence have been pouring into NASA and to this capital from around the world. The Soviets have made it clear this morning that they offer their condolences for the loss. The Soviets have a very major space program. The Soviets and the United States have cooperated in space back on Soyuz Apollo. And so this is clearly a tragedy, as a number of people have pointed out this morning, of quite international proportions. As the Space Shuttle Challenger goes into space and explodes and drives its rockets, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner of your picture, crazily off into space, consuming the Space Shuttle Challenger itself with the 7 astronauts on board. We've said a couple of times that because of the attention given to Christa McAuliffe, she's the one on whom the attention centers. But the others are, and those of you who know them will recognize them best. Dick Scobie, who was the commander of the flight, making his 2nd shuttle flight.
Due to the
Here is Larry Speaks at the White House.
Space Shuttle Mission 51L, the President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the space shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here
Did
tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation
No,
about
the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The President will, will for the balance of the week continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry, Larry, can you
Let's go one at a time.
the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression on the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry,
So,
can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech first initiated. Did the President initiate the idea?
Yes, the President initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Sorry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The President indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
Also, on the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the President's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission. And whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the President attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the shuttle?
The President has not yet done that, no, except to send the Vice President in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
Well, the question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and their drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also does the postponement on the State of the Union push back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled for next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his
you say
specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he viewed as overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that.
On the budget, too, the
question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrew, and then I'm going to go all the way to the back and work forward.
I just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program and
I think
how it might have affected this.
everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the president, including a charge to the director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the president officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened? Well, will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the president's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have through the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanna?
Larry, has the president expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The president is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he as the president directs. He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions, and I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not that. It was the decision made, as he said, these individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the president plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
That hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction has been?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that.
As you recall, the president made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the president's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
Larry Speaks, the spokesman in the briefing room at the White House this morning, saying that all that is on the president's mind at the moment is the concern that he has for the families of those 7 people who were on board this morning. The last question there about did he have any second thoughts about a teacher. Mr. Speaks saying he didn't want to come down too hard on the reporter. He might well have. It was during his election campaign in 1984 that the president suggested a teacher be the first civilian in space as a reflection of the values of education that America stood for. Sam Donaldson is standing by at the White House now. Sam, we heard you pursue Larry Speaks on the subject of canceling the State of the Union. Is this a reflection of how deeply moved the president is by this?
Well, quite clearly, Peter, there was a change of mind between the time, about an hour or so ago, that the president spoke to some of us reporters who were gathered in the Roosevelt Room, when he said that he would continue and he would do the speech tonight, and that life goes on, even though it was a horrible tragedy. He said we can't quit and we can't stop governing the nation. So he changed his mind between that point and the point when Mr. Speaks came out here and made the announcement. I assume that they continued to gauge the great upset, and the president certainly felt it at the time, that this has created here in this country and around the world, and apparently felt it was inappropriate to go ahead with a speech that necessarily, because of the themes that Mr. Reagan had planned, intended to be upbeat, intended to talk about a country that was doing well and where everything was hunky-dory. And I assume that they believed, and I suppose a lot of people will think properly, that to go ahead with that speech after this tragedy today would not have served anybody's interest.
Sam, you know, unlike the rest of us, that when somebody walks in the White House of an official nature, they don't always bring news. William Graham, the acting administrator of NASA, has been in there this morning, and I get the sense, listening to speak, he doesn't have anything to tell the president.
No, I don't think Mr. Reagan knows much more than you know, Peter, or the people who are watching our coverage, because NASA is trying to sort this thing out. We've seen over and over again that terrible explosion. Eyeballing it is, at the moment, plus their telemetry, all that they have until they can try to recover some debris and they can go over that telemetry. So I don't think Mr. Reagan has any more idea of what happened than we do.
A very strong political statement, though, Sam, I thought, from Larry Speaks, which is the best way to honor these people is to go ahead with exploration in space, and that is clearly the attitude at the White House? Oh, I think so. There were a number of questions here today, mildly put because of the adjacency to the tragedy, about the future of the space program. But the president told us, again, an hour and a half ago, that you had to go on, that there have been accidents in every field of transportation since the transportation has begun, and you don't stop transportation. Peter, how many air crashes have we had in the last year or so? 2,000 lives lost, I think, last year. Right. Air transportation goes on. So the thought that you'd stop the space program, now, whether you modify it, whether you go back and look over the safety features, whether you go back and reconsider whether you can, in fact, put an escape hatch in a space shuttle, that's all up for grabs. But no one's going to stop the space program because of this accident. Sam, just one other point. We have been operating here on the thesis that until somebody comes out and tells us officially that the 7 are lost, that there is still hope. I heard Larry Speaks say the same thing. What do they say behind the scenes? Well, Peter, there's not much hope here. You're quite right. Until we have some official declaration that the 7 crewmen are all dead, it would be wise for every one of us to withhold that final judgment. But they saw the explosion just as you did, and they saw the debris on the ocean after they've gotten in there, just as we have. The thought that anyone's still alive is really a very distant one. Sam, thank you very much for joining us. Sam Donaldson at the White House, following Larry Speaks, the White House spokesman, who says the mixture of feeling there overall is one of pride and horror. Pride to watch the Shuttle Challenger go off again and extend America into space with the first reusable spacecraft, and then horror at that which we have all seen this morning. Once again, a reminder, there had been a delay this morning. There had been some bad weather at the Cape yesterday. There had been some problems with the hatch. But this morning, as it has been on so many occasions before, this was the 10th flight for Challenger. A picture-perfect launch against the bright blue skies of the Atlantic. And those great
engines beginning throttling down now.
Cigar case-looking things underneath the shuttle, with big white, if you have color, solid booster fuel rockets on the outside, and in the middle, that enormous tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the main tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines
listen to mission control at Houston as they communicated with us some 3 hours, 4 hours ago.
257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Go with throttle up. Increase your power to make orbit. And it will be hard to forget the voice of the mission control communicator, talking on as he reads off his telemetry, not aware, as those who were watching it were aware, that this tragedy had occurred.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
The search in the Atlantic, about 8 to 10 miles off in the immediate area of Cape Canaveral, goes on. Here's Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Air Force to describe what they're doing.
And what role do you play? You understand we were delayed by approximately an hour after the accident from entering the scene because of falling debris. There was the range safety officer at Cape Canaveral, looking at his radar, determined that debris was falling from the altitudes, and I don't have the highest altitude, but debris continued to fall for 50 minutes and more. And obviously you can't send aircraft and ships into an area where debris is falling, where they themselves may be endangered.
How soon after the explosion were you in the area? In the search?
We were several of these helicopters, and I know the Coast Guard hydrofoil was on the outskirts of the scene immediately, but there was a delay between when they could go in until the debris was clear. The range safety officer said that they were cleared in.
They were there as part of the contingent?
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the U.S. Air Force telling us some very preliminary and very sketchy details of what they've been able to do in terms of mounting a search in the search area just off Cape Canaveral. ABC's Steve Shepard of the Pentagon gives us some more detail of what the military has in fact sent out. The USS Pegasus, a hydrofoil, which about 20 minutes ago was about an hour away from the area. A frigate, the USS Underwood, still not reached the search area. The Coast Guard has sent out a couple of cutters. A third cutter is en route, and a number of helicopters have been sent out as well, and a C-130 to look throughout the search area to see if anything can be found. The first search, obviously, for the clearly remote possibility of survivors, but certainly wanting to pick up the evidence now to try to piece together what went wrong on this horrendous day in space in 1986. I said earlier, in fact, I guess we've been concentrating all morning on Krista McAuliffe, second from the left in your picture there, but the entire crew, as the White House and others have made clear, are all people dedicated to the adventure in space. Judy Resnick was the other woman in space. There are the 7 crew members who had gone. Dick Scobie in the center beside Judy Resnick, who was the commander of the flight. Mike Smith to his right, as you look at it on the screen. He was the co-pilot, even though this was Mike Smith's first shuttle flight. ABC's Stone Phillips has been busily trying to put together some information on the other members of the crew, all of whom appear to have lost their lives this morning, and here is his report.
Challenger's crew trained for this mission for nearly a year. The woman on the far left, teacher Barbara Miller, was an alternate, a standby for Krista McAuliffe, and did not go on the mission. The spacecraft commander, Francis Scobie, age 46, born and raised in Washington State, became a NASA astronaut in 1979 after 22 years in the Air Force, including combat tour in Vietnam. Scobie earned the Air Force Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal. As a test pilot, he logged more than 5,300 hours in some 40 different aircraft. This was Scobie's second shuttle mission. He is survived by his wife and 2 children. Challenger's pilot on this 25th shuttle launch was Michael Smith, age 40, a decorated Navy pilot from North Carolina, who became a shuttle astronaut in 1980. This was his first mission. He is survived by his wife and 3 children. Mission specialist Judy Resnick became an astronaut in 1978. Her specialty, electrical engineering. This was her second shuttle mission. She had logged 144 hours, 57 minutes in space. Ronald McNair, age 36, also a mission specialist, was selected as an astronaut in 1979. He, too, was a veteran of the shuttle, making his first shuttle flight in 1984, bringing his background in physics and laser technology to the program. The third mission specialist on today's launch was Air Force Colonel Ellison Onizuka, age 39, born in Hawaii. A former aerospace engineer and pilot, He had taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California. He became a NASA astronaut in 1979. Onizuka was on his second shuttle mission. His initial flight in 1984 was the first dedicated to the Department of Defense. He was married with 2 children. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on fluids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, this was Jarvis's first shuttle mission. He is survived by his wife. And finally, Krista McAuliffe, age 37, the social studies teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen selected to fly aboard the shuttle. She'd been chosen from more than 11,000 applicants nationwide. She's survived by her husband, 2 children, and the students in Concord, New Hampshire.
ABC Stone Phillips, I'm sorry it took us a while to get to that, to bring you the human dimension of the other people in the crew, and the reason I think for that is because Krista McAuliffe was the first civilian in space, the first teacher, and as is our and the nation's tendency, you tend to focus, I think, on the first. But there is some indication of the human side of the other 6 members of the crew who all appear to have lost their lives over the Atlantic Ocean this morning. Just to pick up on a couple of pieces of information, the Space Agency now says it is going to have at least a statement at 3:30 this afternoon, Eastern Time. The indication so far that we're getting, certainly from the White House and from Cape Canaveral and from Houston, is that they do not know a great deal yet, but by 3:30 this afternoon, Eastern Time, they will have something to say. Larry Speaks in his briefing to White House reporters announcing that the State of the Union was going to be officially postponed for a week also alluded to the fact that the President might want to talk to the nation this evening about this human tragedy and this clear setback to America's adventures in space. And even while he said that one of the great ways to honor these people would be to go ahead with the space program, the President may indeed want to share his thoughts with the nation this evening in a more personal way than via Mr. Speaks. And if he does, we shall, of course, be here to bring them to you. ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space on a regular basis for us, is standing by in California. Lynn, I know you've been trying to talk to some other people who were involved in the program. Have you come up with anything?
Well, yes, I'm afraid I don't have the answers that we really want, which are what happened. But I have talked to some of the astronauts at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. The mood there, as you can well expect, is very glum. All of the astronauts who travel frequently around this country and abroad, of course, have been recalled to Houston to help deal with the situation, to deal with the crisis. And one of the things, unfortunately, that they have to start doing is deal, of course, with the families and the effects of their colleagues. I wanted to point out also that when something like this happens, it really affects the entire space community. There is no one, for all the petty jealousies that go on, for all the competition, there is no one who will be gloating about this accident, specifically the Soviets. I obviously do not know this firsthand, but judging by what's happened in the past, there have been 4 Soviet cosmonauts, of course, who were killed. American astronauts have felt extremely sympathetic. They are all colleagues in space. And I would bet that that exact emotion is going on in the Soviet Union right now.
Lynn, it's very interesting that one of the very first messages of condolence we had this morning of a public way was, in fact, from the Soviet embassy. So that as you do is you share this interest and fascination in space.
Well, it's true. I mean, after all, they lost 4 cosmonauts in space before we lost any. We have lost astronauts on the ground, but there's that feeling among all of them that they're all doing the same thing despite the political problems and the political competition. So that there's a grand sense of loss and despair among the entire space community. And one other thing, when Senator Glenn was speaking, I noticed his very moving thoughts. This is a man very graciously did not say something. When the space flight participant program began, the Citizens in Space program, Senator Glenn, and when the politicians went up, Senator Garn and Congressman Bill Nelson, John Glenn, who of course had been there himself and had gone the other direction, didn't think it was a good idea. He said, I don't think private citizens should go. This is not a joyride. His feeling is the space program, obviously a very professional thing, should be left to the professionals. I noticed he didn't comment on that, as I say, very gracious of him.
Lynn, let me stop you first. Lynn, let me stop you for a second, because you keep talking about astronauts as special people, and I think to some extent we've forgotten to go all the way back to Mercury. In those days of the Mercury program, the astronauts criticized NASA because they were just being sent along for the ride at one point. You talk about them playing a key role in trying to find out what's happening.
Well, I think the space program has changed enormously, Peter. In the beginning, in fact, as much as they don't want to accept the fact, the Mercury astronauts were at first passengers. Things changed. They got much more control because they agitated for it over running their spacecraft. The space shuttle astronauts now are not simply pilots and they're not simply scientists who do experiments. They are actively involved in developing the spacecraft, in designing the missions, in determining what is going to be done up there. And they're probably not involved as much as they'd like to be. They have their own problems with management. But they are really part of it. They are not just bodies that get placed in the vehicle to go do a job. They're very much in their training, for instance. If an astronaut is not training for a specific mission, that particular astronaut may well be off planning somebody else's mission. He or she may well be off learning how something in the vehicle works, how to make it better, how to recruit new astronauts. They're involved in every single aspect of this program. So we're not just talking about pilots. We're not just talking about someone that goes up there to perform an experiment. It's very different. And certainly the professional astronauts are entirely aware of the danger that is potential. It is not clear whether the payload specialists, Greg Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe, have that complete sense of it, but the astronauts know, and they accept it.
Lynn, speaking of payload, and this is clearly a setback, perhaps only a temporary one for the space program, what are the military implications? The military has become one of the big users of the space shuttle. Can you give us some sense of that?
Well, I think that it's going to be, first of all, as you've been saying all morning, an enormous setback for the whole program. The next military flight is the one that is supposed to be taking off from the Vandenberg Air Force Base out here in California. That has already been postponed several times. It was meant to go in March, then it got put off until the summer, and it's not clear when that will happen. They now not only have to worry about getting their new launch pad finished in time or at a reasonable time, but they now have to worry about the entire system. And in fact, the Air Force has been counting on the fact that the system has worked so wonderfully. So of course, that is going to be a problem for them. The military is very, very dependent on the space shuttle.
Let me draw together something that Sam Donaldson said and something we both covered, and that is the crash of the Arrow Air plane at Gander in Newfoundland, which is taking a very long period to find out even why it crashed. Is it safe to say, do you think, that this program is going to be halted until they find out when it went wrong with this?
I think it's very safe to say. I suspect we're looking at several months, 6 months. I don't know, obviously. You asked me a question earlier in the broadcast that I never got a chance to answer, which was the black box question. There is no black box on board. There's nothing that they can hope to recover that will tell them what happened. All their data is already on the ground, on their little screens, and in their machines. What they can recover, though, are those chunks, pieces, anything that will help tell them where the explosion might have taken place. I think it is going to be a very long delay, and this, of all years, was a major year for NASA. What a tight schedule they've had.
Well, among those people you've talked to today, and perhaps you can pursue it with them, should there be this long a delay? In fact, this was the 10th flight of Challenger. There were going to be 15 flights this year, which are important to the nation, not only in the military context, important to the international community. If we wait as long as they did for Air India crash or for the Arrow Air crash, you could hold up the program indefinitely.
Well, it's absolutely true. The next mission, which seems very minor by comparison to what happened today, but the highlight of the next mission was going to be a look at Halley's Comet. That, of course, is Columbia. It was not meant to be Challenger, but I cannot imagine that that is going to get off anywhere near on time, because I can't imagine they're going to have figured out the problem by then. Again, I am guessing. I do not know the answer to that. They've had a number of serious scientific missions planned for this year, and the most exciting one that comes to my mind is the scheduled launch of the shuttle now in October to launch the Space Telescope. This is a telescope that is finally going to enable us to see far beyond in the solar system than we have ever seen before. And it is unclear to me how they can possibly keep a schedule until they figure out exactly what went wrong.
Okay, Lynn, thank you very much. We'll come back to you shortly. Gene Cernan is still standing by in Houston. Gene, I guess at moments of crisis, we tend to ask the negative questions rather than the positive ones. Having said that, are we expecting too much from this reusable spacecraft?
Peter, no, I think the spacecraft is to some degree designed almost beyond its expectations and being able to put man and machine in orbit. The potential for the space shuttle, to me, was going to be the DC-3 through the end of the century, and was going to more than pay for the effort and the time and the money. And indeed, at this point in time, I guess I can say, as I look into the future, into the lives that it cost.
Gene, we heard Lynn say no black box, that what they have is the telemetry, the data they have already there, and the pieces of debris they'll pick up. Where do you start? What do you begin? What do you look for first?
Well, you know, the black box is almost a continuous open loop from the spacecraft to the ground in terms of the amount of information it provides the controllers, and there's reams of tape information from that is run through the computers that is already, I'm sure, being gone through on a cursory basis so that NASA can come up with some kind of preliminary feeling, but I don't think they, at this point in time, or in the next several days or weeks, will be able to commit to any particular, or zero on any particular cause or reason for this failure until they go through that data. Of course, that, along with any pieces of material or debris or anything that they may be able to recover from the ocean, is going to be certainly important in the piece of this whole mystery. And that's what it is, a mystery, because I go back to the fact as we review the tapes and look at the film of the explosion, it appears nobody, the crew, the ground, certainly any of us viewers had any thoughts about this happening at that instant.
And based on what you've been saying to us this morning, Gene, and based on what we've been hearing from Houston, Houston doesn't appear to have an edge on us at the moment.
Peter, I've heard everything that's gone on this morning. I've heard the president's comments, many of which his information comes right from the administrator of NASA at this point in time. I've picked up other things in my office. The phone here has been ringing off the hook. I don't think anybody is any smarter than you and I are at this point in time, and I'm not sure that anyone will be for several days into the future.
Gene, I'm glad you're with us at this point, because what we're tending to do on the half hour, as people perhaps may or may not join the network, is to go back and look at this horrible incident this morning. Gene Cernan, as you know, was the last man to walk on the moon. He was a member of the Apollo 17 flight crew. Gene, as you describe it and talk about it this time, could you try it again to put us in the seat of the pilot or a member of the crew member as they lift off?
All right, I'll do my best at this point in time. This is a moment the entire crew waits for, you know, with the delays that have gone on. This is a time when no one can say no when you're on your way. It's a feeling of exultation as well as satisfaction, but now you've got it all in your hands. That crew is flying in mission at this point in time, and they're on their way. They can feel the thrust and the rumble of those engines is phenomenal. It's hard to explain unless you've been there, but you can just imagine from what you've seen. And now at this point, having been there several times, I can tell you that you begin never to feel complacent, but you do begin to feel that things are working in your favor. The most critical time of this mission, at least in most of our eyes, was those first 10 or 15 seconds to get off the pad. And so the surprise of what is to occur at this point in time was, I'm sure, even beyond comprehension of the crew, although there was several minutes yet to go on the flight. Anything can happen as we see it well. The crew now is getting down to almost a pseudo-routine. It's dynamic, things are happening, but they have practiced this over and over again. And should there be an emergency, and should they detect an emergency, they would have been able to separate from those boosters and get off and land a vehicle home. But as we see in a moment, I use the word consumed several times. I have no other word. The spacecraft was literally consumed in microseconds. Neither the crew, and as we've heard, neither the ground, nobody, even in, not only didn't anticipate it, almost didn't realize it happened.
We've said it many times before, Gene, and again for people just joining us perhaps first time, the mission control communicator just went on talking as if he had missed it and had not seen it at all. Gene Cernan joining us again this morning to help us understand the dimensions of what happened, though none of us, of course, at this point know what happened, and that appears to include everybody, the White House, NASA, none of us at this point understanding what really did happen on board the Challenger this morning. NASA is going to make a statement and perhaps answer questions at 3:30 this afternoon. We shall be there. We hope you will be there to try to find if there are any further answers, and we will stay with you here today as long as there is any news and any development to report. Some will bring you up to date with in just a moment, but the crew again. 7 members on board. Gregory Jarvis, he was an engineer with Hughes Aircraft. He was the payload specialist on board. He is survived, as best we can tell, by his wife, Marcia. The information he brought back from this mission could have been crucial to the design of new liquid-fueled rockets. Francis Dick Scobie, he was the commander of the flight. He was making his second shuttle flight. He has a wife, June, and 2 children. He made his first shuttle flight back in 1984, was spoken of as a fine and able commander by all those people who had worked with him. He was also an Air Force jet fighter pilot and had been in Vietnam. Mike Smith, he was the shuttle co-pilot. He's a 40-year-old commander in the Navy. He was trained as a test pilot. He also served in Vietnam. This was actually Mike Smith's first shuttle flight, sitting in the co-pilot's seat. Ronald McNair, the mission specialist. He was doing research on lasers. At the time he was selected as an astronaut, he had a PhD from MIT. He became an astronaut in 1979. It was his second shuttle mission. He also has a wife and 2 children. Judy Resnick, one of the 2 women on board. She is single, as you can see on your screen. She was the second American woman to go into space. She was, among other things, a classical pianist who earned a doctorate in electorate engineering. And you may recall her from one of the previous shuttle missions. She was the woman who operated the robot arm, the so-called Canadarm, which has been used for any variety of missions once the shuttle was safely in orbit. Ellison Onizuka, who is from Hawaii, he was an aerospace engineer, and he taught at the Air Force's test pilot school in California, where among the very best in the country go. He was also, we were talking a little bit earlier about the military, he was one of the crew members on that secret Defense Department shuttle mission of last January. He also was married and has 2 children, Ellison Onizuka. And clearly the most famous member of this mission, Krista McAuliffe, known as the teacher in space. She is survived by her husband, Steve, who we've talked to this morning, or heard this morning, and her 2 children. And as I think it was Stone Phillips, ABC's reporter, said earlier on, survived by all of the children, not only in New Hampshire, but also around the country, who clearly identified with her, as did a great many of the rest of us. We do not, I must confess, have a great deal that we can tell you at the moment, except to really review across the country and around the world, as Lynn Sure pointed out when she was talking about the Soviets. People have been coming forward to express their condolences. The president stood in shock this morning. We were over at the White House this morning, a number of reporters being briefed from the White House point of view on the President's State of the Union message this evening, which has now been canceled. The President was handed a note, as were the rest of us. He stood in shocked silence to learn what many people in the nation who had been watching it had already learned, that 7 people appear to have died on board Challenger about 2.5 minutes, or a little more than 2 minutes after it left Cape Canaveral in a bright blue sky. Since then, if there has been an overall tendency, at least here in the nation's capital, among officials, it has been to express enormous sadness and great shock, but also dedication to the program. We heard from Senator Jake Garn, who was one of the 2 politicians to fly in space. Congressman Bill Nelson is the other. We haven't heard from him in person this morning. That one of the ways to honor the people is to go ahead with the space program. We heard the same from Senator John Glenn. We've heard from so many people what I think many of our own reactions have been, that we'd all become so accustomed to the safety and the routineness with which the Space Shuttle Challenger and the other 3 presently active space shuttles go into space, that this is an enormous double setback. Challenger is one of 4, as we said. There was Columbia, there is Discovery, and there is Atlantis. The first test vehicle, as some of you may recall, was named Enterprise, but it was used just as a test vehicle and did not carry people into space. And they were now on a rotation, 15 flights planned for this year, as the space shuttle, the world's first reusable spacecraft, goes into something of a, I think I've heard people call it as a bus service, carrying experiments and individuals doing experiments into space on a very regular basis. This to have been an extremely active year with 15 flights. As the President reminded us this morning, this is the first accident that the American space program has actually had of this magnitude, certainly involving human life in space. Though you will recall back in 1967 that 3 American astronauts died in a fire on the pad at Cape Canaveral, Gus Grissom, Chafee, and Ed White, who died at the middle of a tragic accident when their spacecraft caught on fire on the pad back in 1967. And those of you who have followed the space program below these many years as simply watchers will recall, at that time, the enormous sense of tragedy that gripped the nation about those three very courageous and adventurous men. Now, as I said a short while ago, this has been a tragedy of very much international proportions. The Soviets have a space program. The Europeans have a very active space program. In fact, the Europeans and the Japanese at the moment have spacecraft up there looking for Halley's Comet, something the United States does not have. To give you some sense now of how the rest of, not the rest of the world, but how some of the rest of the world has reacted, here's ABC's Mike Lee, who's in London.
The British public first learned of the shuttle tragedy through late afternoon TV news bulletins.
The space shuttle explodes just after takeoff. All 7 on board are feared dead.
The Space Shuttle Challenger has exploded and disintegrated shortly after takeoff. It was carrying a crew of 7, including a woman teacher, and there are no reports of any survivors. Reaction on the streets is one of disbelief and shock.
Terrific, yeah, sure. That's absolutely terrible.
I'm just shocked. I, just come in and
I want to ask you 2 things.
I'm quite amazed about it. Speechless, really.
And there is a statement from the 4 British astronauts due to join the U.S. Space Shuttle program on future missions. We are saddened by the tragic loss of life at Kennedy Space Center, and our deepest sympathy is extended to the wives and families of the shuttle crew. At this moment, says the British astronaut statement, the full circumstances are not known. Therefore, its impact on the Skynet 4 program cannot be determined. Throughout this country, as indeed throughout the world, people were standing by their TV sets, in homes, offices, and in pubs for the latest news. In the Soviet Union, the news was announced by TASS and dispatched from New York. And Soviet TV tonight carried pictures of the tragedy from Florida. Peter, as you might imagine, reaction is coming in from all over the world. The first European reaction we have from President Mitterrand of France in a cable to President Reagan in which he says that the French people have, quote, a profound emotion and sincere compassion for the astronauts on board. He added, it's always the destiny of courageous people, discoverers of new worlds, to pay a heavy price for progress. Also in France, the astronauts from Ariane, the European space program, have issued a statement saying that they've heard with great emotion of the space shuttle tragedy, and they are affected, saying, quote, our group is in deepest sympathy with NASA during these moments. All the men and women of Ariane are deeply sad for the members of the crew and their families. They know the extraordinary ability of Americans to overcome their problems and remain confident of the future of space transport. Now, also, there are some reactions, and I must say a bit of speculation from this part of the world as to what the cause may have happened. Something more or less neutral from the French astronaut Patrick Boudret, who was a recent, as you know, shuttle crew member. He expressed his sadness and made some practical observations. He said the shuttle is a machine. These things, he said, do happen. You have to have confidence when you climb on board. It's never routine, he said. It's very delicate work with highly trained and dedicated people. NASA, he said, does not make mistakes. A further observation from the French astronaut is that the shuttle is under total control of computers during the first 2 minutes of flight. There is other reactions. Peter, if you have any questions, we'll move on from there.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions, Mike. I mean, it's very interesting because Patrick Boudret does bring up a good point there, that under the first 2 minutes of flight, NASA's under the control of computers and not being flown by individuals, which is something we have not vigorously pointed out this morning. I guess from having lived where you now sit for the moment, I've always had the feeling that a tragedy like this, it tends to draw the rest of the world somehow closer and more sympathetically to America, even at times when we're not very popular. Are you getting that sense this morning at all?
No question about it. It's early moments yet, but I've been out on the street and talking to people in stores and in pubs and on the street, and it was almost disbelief followed by shock, and it's sort of, how could that thing happen, and gee, what a horrible thing to have happened to the Americans. And I don't think there's any question that people are drawn closer in a circumstance like this. Also here, I must stress that this is speculation, although it comes from scientists. British scientists are speculating that the unusually cold weather in Florida might have caused metal to contract in the Challenger, possibly causing stress when heated fuel was pumped to the engines. And one scientist said that that could have caused a sudden rip in the engine. Again, this is speculation from far away, but as you know, as is often the case, the people closest to it are the most cautious and perhaps the least likely to make statements of that kind early on. Again, from West Germany, a reaction in the disaster, we are told, has stunned everyone because they watched it live on television, because in West Germany, that's when the television newscasts were on the air that time of day. And Hans Kamensky, who is head of Germany's Space Observatory at Bochum, said that he was shocked but not surprised. Starting with such a complicated machine, he said, is filled with dangerous moments. Kamensky added that he said the explosion could have been caused by a breakup of solid fuel engine that subsequently ripped one of the large oxygen tanks and hydrogen tanks. Quote, that could result in an explosion pulverizing the whole system.
I think the difficulty with...
reaction we have so far.
I was going to say, I think the difficulty with speculation at this time is that reporters like you and me at this time are always asking people to speculate. It's probably unfair of us to do so. But it is interesting to hear the reaction from the European space community particularly, Mike, because in some ways NASA and the European space community are quite competitive.
No doubt about it. And keep in mind that the British have 4 astronauts who are due to fly on future missions with the Americans.
Mike, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you'll hang around even though it's about 8:45 in the evening there, and will keep us up to date with European reaction, if not always with speculation as the rest of the evening progresses. Just to repeat in terms of speculation that officially nobody knows very much at this moment, period. The acting NASA administrator, William Graham, went to see the president at the White House, and he left, and we came away talking to Sam Donaldson with a very strong impression that he had not been able to provide the president with very much information. We have been in contact with Cape Canaveral earlier today, where John Quinones of ABC is, and there is no answer from there. Houston is the place we look to as the afternoon progresses, because once the shuttle is off the ground and launched, the control of the mission transfers from the Cape Canaveral, to mission control in Houston, which I guess most of you already know. ABC's Charles Gibson is standing by on Capitol Hill this morning, from which we've already heard some fairly strong reaction. Charlie, is there a sense of the Congress at this moment?
Well, Peter, I think the sense of the Congress is the sense of everyone else. The first reaction is obviously a human reaction. The second reaction, to express confidence in the space program that had been operating so well, where there had been 24 perfectly successful shuttle flights up to this point. But then, inevitably, Congress raises questions, and there are a number of questions that will be raised in coming days. It's not going to be immediate. No one here, any more than anyone else, has any explanations of what happened. A number of members of Congress from the relevant committees have been talking to NASA officials. NASA is not speculating yet, and so, of course, either are members of Congress as about what may have happened today. But there are already questions under discussion about now what will happen to the space program and what effects this may have. Of course, Congress always thinks in terms of funding. And a number of members, I've had a chance to ask a number of members whether they expect this will have any effect on NASA's funding, either to the negative or to the positive. And they've all said no, they don't really expect many changes. There was no change, for instance, in the level of NASA funding, although it was going up very fast in those days, after the 1967 tragedy involving Apollo and the astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee. And so they don't expect any change there, but nor do they expect particularly a raise in funding, because, of course, Congress is living with the realities now of Graham-Rudman. And that is of concern. All of a sudden, NASA has $1 billion to $2 billion problem in that they had 4 flying aircraft. Now they'll have only 3. They have to replace that, and yet NASA can expect funding cuts in future months because of the Graham-Rudman requirements to cut the budget. So there are real questions as to what will happen in that regard.
Charlie, would you also give us some sense of priority? When something like this happens, we become very consumed by it. The White House sets aside the State of the Union, which was awaited with great anticipation on the Hill because of the Graham-Rudman budget-cutting bill, which you have just mentioned. How long does Congress put things aside?
Well, as I say, Peter, I think the reaction is very human. Right now, on the floor of the House, there is discussion of a resolution to express condolences to the families of the crew members and to recess for the day out of respect to all of them. There was a strong feeling here, for instance, right away, that it would be inappropriate for the President to come up to deliver the State of the Union address tonight. Larry Speaks was very correct that the members of Congress concurred in the President's decision not to come, but they really concurred before the decision was made. I think there was a general feeling that it would be improper to have the President come up. So as I say, the first reaction is very human. There is sympathy and shock. Bob Michael on the floor of the House just a few moments ago said he felt the same wrenching in his gut when he saw what happened on television this morning as he felt at the time of the Hindenburg disaster, which he was listening to on radio when that occurred. And so, you know, members of Congress react like all of us in very human terms. So when I say they're raising these questions now, I emphasize that it is in the context with those very human reactions coming first. Bill Nelson, the member from Florida, who was on the last shuttle mission, a member of Congress who went up in space, as you recall, and his district includes Cape Canaveral, stood up a moment ago and said that he knows every one of those crew members were aware of the risks when they got on that shuttle. He was aware of them when he got on. You feel that all the time, he said, but then he wound up his speech on this resolution by quoting Helen Keller and saying that if life is not a daring adventure, it is nothing. But as I say, they have raised these questions. There is the concerns about whether NASA may have been pushing very quickly with the shuttle program because they were trying to prove its commercial viability. George Brown of California, who is probably the best expert in the House on the militarization of space, raised the doubts that the Air Force has had about the manned shuttle program. The Air Force, which is going to be one of the biggest customers of the shuttle program, has been saying that they could go their own way and probably do it cheaper with unmanned vehicles. And Brown raised the question as to whether or not NASA will now have to look more and more to unmanned vehicles and possibly reorient their program more and more toward unmanned spacecraft. Now, these are all questions that are going to be discussed for weeks on end. There's the other question. You know, President Reagan's program, the space station, that was going to have to be constructed with labor from the shuttle. The shuttle would go up and take the parts for the construction of the space station up. The space station would be constructed, and then the shuttle would take manned crews back and forth to the space station. Well, that will now get a harder look in Congress because of what has happened here, and the President may have a tougher time selling that program. So there are all kinds of ramifications in future days. One member of Congress said, for instance, he thinks there'll be no journalists in space now. He doubts that the civilians will be sent up with the rapidity that NASA was talking about getting to that area.
Charles,
so as I say, many questions to be answered.
Isn't there really another side to this, too, that very often when there's a setback in a program like this, the public's attention is drawn much more directly to the overall space program than it is normally, and it could actually get a boost in the Congress?
Yes, although, as I said, we've already asked that question to a number of members, and because of the first way, obviously, we talk about a boost is in financial. That's the way these guys deal, obviously. And the first question is financial, and most members are doubting that there will be an increase in NASA funding, although in the long run, it may redound to a closer look at NASA and more confidence in the long run, but that's a long way from knowing.
Charles, thank you very much for joining us. Sure. Charles Gibson on Capitol Hill, and a reminder, after hearing from Charles some of the if you will, negative futurist reaction from members of Congress, that 24 shuttle missions had already been accomplished. And to remind you that we now have, in the history of the U.S. space program, 10 people who have died. 3 on the ground back in 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, when their spacecraft caught on fire on the pad, and now the 7 astronauts and mission specialists on board today. So 10 in the history of the space program. And as Lynn Scher and others have pointed out, a very vigorous program for this year in terms of 15 missions planned for this year alone. Let's go back to Lynn Scher in California for just a second. Lynn, to raise this one question which other people have raised, the aggressiveness of NASA in terms of using the shuttle to prove its commercial viability. What's your own sense of that?
They have been aggressive. This is what they said they were going to do, and they are trying to fulfill it. They are not, by the way, being nearly as aggressive as they originally planned to be. They were talking about 24 shuttle flights a year originally, a turnaround time every 2 weeks. That has clearly not been possible. But what they're doing is simply a little bit beneath what they've said they were doing all along. This is nothing new, this aggressiveness. It is not new for them to be competitive. What is new, I think, for the American public has been, up till today, to understand that the American space program is not necessarily always going to be the first and the only one doing something. I'm talking about the fact that the European Space Agency, as you've been mentioning, has got the Halley probe. The Russians have a Halley probe, which we do not. The Europeans are also talking about building, the French are talking about building a shuttle. The Japanese, the Chinese are talking about going into competition to launch satellites, unmanned flights, and they would like to have an astronaut program too, some of those countries. So yes, NASA has been forced into a more competitive situation, but I have not personally seen evidence in the last year, and we've asked it every single time there was a delay. I have not seen evidence that they were pushing too hard. I have not seen evidence that they were necessarily cutting corners in order to do what they said they were going to do. Again, I want to go back to what Senator Glenn said earlier today. Their primary motivation with humans on board has been safety. That's why there are delays on a regular basis. And I have had the sense that that is what they are doing. This investigation, of course, may turn up something to change that.
Lynn, putting aside what Charles Gibson said, quoting one congressman about a journalist in space, what would the reaction be in the space community if civilians were suddenly banned from riding the shuttle?
I don't know. I think that after today's accident, there will be quite a bit of rethinking. I will tell you that at the Jet Propulsion Lab here in California, where we were following the unmanned Voyager mission of the planet Uranus, there was utter silence, utter shock, utter disbelief. These are their colleagues, their cousins in space, if you will, the people that send up the unmanned probes. And everybody always wants everything to succeed where it comes to space. So I don't know the answer to that, Peter. I suppose there is certainly a level of getting back to basics, which is the space program, you have to worry about safety. It is for professionalism. By the same token, the reason a journalist was going to go, and probably still is going to go in space, is because the press needs to be where news is happening. And if we don't have reporters vigorously reporting on every aspect of the space program, even in the future, certainly more in the future, then we're not going to really know what's going on. So I guess, having said I don't know, maybe I changed my mind. I think there would be a large hue and cry. They've got to solve the problem, but they're committed to taking people up, therefore they have to take reporters up as well.
Okay, Lynn, thank you very much. Charlie Gibson back on the Hill has an observation. Charlie?
Well, Peter, as Lynn was talking, I think she just put the finger on what many members of Congress have been saying, the back-to-basics phrase. And as one member said from California, he said that NASA's going to have to rein in the PR, and that's what I think putting a reporter up would have constituted. And he also said, I don't think as many members of Congress ought to be going up. Harold Volkmer of Missouri, for instance, said as a member of Congress who was offered a trip and refused, he said, I think this will show some of us that we ought to get back to basics in effect. So I think that the investigation will be pointed in that direction by some members of Congress, that they would like NASA to stick a little bit more to what they conceive as the mission and not worrying about the flashier aspects in effect. Lynn's point about reporters being where the news is being made is perfectly valid, but I think in this case there may be some pushing on NASA to curtail those kinds of activities. There have been civilians up in space, of course, pharmacists and civilian engineers, etc. But as a couple of members of Congress have said, if there are going to be civilians up there, they should be up there with very specific scientific mission requirements, and not people who are just watching or contributing or whatever.
No humanity in space, Artie, just science, right?
They all took pains to say, of course, that in this case a teacher could have been a very valuable thing to have, and of course everybody has had only the nicest things to say about Ms. McAuliffe, who was going up today. But basically I think there will be a feeling that we've got to get back to basics, as Lynn said.
Well, Lynn, for the moment at least, the last word on this subject to you.
Well, having said all that, I don't agree that NASA necessarily has to rein in the PR. I don't think that by opening the program to private citizens and to people who have legitimate reasons to be there, like reporters, that they are in one way, in any way, compromising on safety. I think they are simply adding a feature. There is absolutely no evidence that by letting someone else go that they've stopped checking the engines or that they've cut corners in terms of making sure everything was functioning perfectly. I think NASA's PR gets a little overblown from time to time, but it is an open space program, and that's what it's meant to be. And I think we are partly responsible for some of the thrills with building up the teacher, if you will. NASA is still trying to do its job, and again, let's see what the investigation turns up.
Okay, Lynn, thank you very much. And of course, that is what has brought us onto the air today in such with such extended news coverage. It is this enormous setback to the space program, but primarily the loss of 7 Americans in space, the first time that anybody has been killed in space. And that is our and everybody else's assumption at the moment since 1967, when 3 American astronauts were killed on the ground. But as Charles Gibson and Lynn Scher and others at the White House and at NASA made so very clear, it sometimes takes a tragedy like this to extend and to broaden the debate about what America's role is in space, both in a human way and in terms of a technological way. For those of you who may just be joining us now, we have come to another half hour, and therefore let us remind you that it was, in fact, at mid-morning, late morning, Eastern Standard Time, 10 miles above Cape Canaveral, 8 miles downrange, when the Space Shuttle Challenger with 7 crew members on board met its fate.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
(11:39 a.m. Eastern Standard Time). The shuttle makes its now familiar roll with both of its solid fuel rockets pumping away.
65% shortly.
Main engine thrust. Those two
65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
port and starboard, right and left rockets would normally fall away and be reused again.
Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Approaching 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Off into space. As to the best of our knowledge, everything else virtually disintegrated. You were looking at a plume of smoke that is 10 miles high over the Atlantic Ocean, about 8 to 10 miles, almost 20 miles actually, downrange from Cape Canaveral as the rocket.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Boosting Challenger at that moment of enormous pressure, the greatest pressure in terms of liftoff generally, to its orbit, which of course it never made. I confess I am no expert with these models, but this is what we're accustomed to seeing. These are the 2 solid fuel rockets which fall off normally and fall away into the Atlantic Ocean. This is the main engine, which is hydrogen oxide and oxygen in a very light canister. And as we looked at the pictures earlier with Gene Cernan, the former astronaut from Apollo 17, we saw this tremendous flare here under the actual shuttle itself, which, had it reached orbit, would, of course, and even if it had some warning of trouble, as people have pointed out to us, those who are experts in the subject have known this morning, if they'd known they had trouble, they could have lifted the shuttle off that main engine and made their way somehow to safety, because the aircraft, as you know, or the shuttle, which is an aircraft, has the capacity to land at a variety of places around the globe. We have seen a lot of pictures and heard a lot of words from Cape Canaveral today. We've not yet had an opportunity to see, and we now shall. ABC's John Quinones, who was down there at the Cape covering the launch. John, I guess the first thing is very simple. How do folks feel there?
Well, this is described as catastrophic, the impact on NASA. I was just speaking to Jim Mizell, one of NASA's spokesmen. He's been with the space agency for more than 20 years. We've talked to him frequently here at NASA. He says this is a tragedy of catastrophic proportions, but he says we will recover, just as we did from the old Apollo mission, referring, of course, to the tragedy in the early 70s when here at Cape Canaveral we lost 3 other astronauts on a practice mission.
John, that is the launch pad off your right shoulder, as I recall.
That's correct.
I thought I heard you saying this morning that there were hundreds of people there. There was a day when we had thousands. How big was the crowd?
The crowd, I would say, was around 500. Among them, of course, Krista McAuliffe's parents, her husband, and her 2 children. There were many other school children watching. We listening to Lynn and Charlie talk about the impact on journalists and other teachers in space. One wonders about the children. Hundreds of thousands, of course, watching this on television, wanting to be astronauts someday, what sort of impact this will have on their careers.
As we watched the videotape earlier of people actually watching it with their eyes strained to the sky, I got a very strong impression that people didn't know what had happened.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. We did not realize what had happened until we saw the pluming, the streaking smoke about 60 seconds after liftoff. You may have seen those pictures of Krista McAuliffe's a mother who was smiling and crying, tears of joy, a very proud mother and father, as they watched the spaceship head into space. They had no idea until there was an announcement here about a minute and 15 seconds into the flight that something had gone wrong, that there was an explosion. But no, the spectators did not realize that. And many of them, this was the first time they had visited and watched a liftoff.
John, many Americans have become accustomed to the enormous sound of liftoff, that roar that knocks you almost off the top of buildings nearby. When the explosion occurred, it was 10 miles up. Could you hear it?
No, there was an eerie quiet, Peter. We did not hear an explosion. We just simply saw it. It was 10 miles up in the air. It began to fall apart. There was that streaking of white smoke, a reddish ball of fire that quickly disintegrated, and then again pieces of the spacecraft seemed to fall apart. Later we saw two parachutes. The rescue team was already on top of it, but there was no sound.
The people who had gathered there, the approximately 500 this morning, I must say, really did strike us. There are Mr. and Mrs. McAuliffe with this enormous sense of pride as only they could have.
Yes, you're looking at Krista McAuliffe's parents there. Obviously very, very excited and proud. And again, I don't think she realized what had gone wrong. You'll hear some applause now. They think that is part of the liftoff. They, again, not realizing that it actually was an explosion.
First stage separation, as we pointed out a number of times this morning, looks not dissimilar in terms of the flaming impact of it from the explosion itself. And we have lost that tape, and I must confess it's not such a bad thing to have lost it. John, at Cape Canaveral itself now, even though the control of the mission transfers to Houston, much of the investigation transfers to Houston, this is a place there in Florida that has an ingrained sense of space history. What do people think about the future now, or is it too early to judge?
Well, these are very, very committed professionals. There is a sense of mourning. No one, in a sense, however, of determination to carry on from those, the old guard here at NASA has vowed to do that privately. They're saying that NASA has instructed everyone, of course, not to say much publicly yet until their investigation is conducted. They now have impounded, by the way, all flight data from this mission. They're studying that. We should have a briefing, a press release, some word on what happened in about half an hour. But there is a real sense of mourning, of great loss here. There are tears in some people's eyes, and of course, in the eyes of the spectators who watched it here, stunned in disbelief.
John, thank you very much for joining us. John Quinones, who's been covering launches at us now for some time at Cape Canaveral. The House of Representatives, you've seen involved on a variety of levels this morning. You heard Charles Gibson a short while ago talking at length about the individual observations of various congressmen and women. The House actually passed a resolution this morning resolving to express its condolences to the family of the crew members of the Challenger mission, and that it be further resolved the clerk communicate these resolutions to the family of the Challenger crew, and be it further resolved that the House adjourn as a mark of respect to the memory of the valiant crew members of the Shuttle Challenger. So the politics of this city and this nation have been very much affected today, because not only does the House adjourn as a mark of respect, but as we learned first from the House Speaker's office and then subsequently from the White House, the President has canceled, to be more specific, postponed his State of the Union message for at least a week, though there is some indication from the White House, which we perhaps should check if somebody can, that the President may want to talk to the nation a little earlier or a little later this evening. That is possible, I am told in my ear. The President may want to talk to the nation this evening about this tragedy. But it will now be next week when the President goes to Capitol Hill to give his State of the Union message, a tradition as old as this nation, vastly older, of course, than the space program. And from around the country and from around the world, you have been hearing communications of sorrow and sadness, and also of challenge to the American space program, though in some cases that perhaps coming from the more expectable individuals Congressman Bill Nelson from Florida, who flew on the last shuttle, Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who has also been a civilian member on board the shuttle, saying, as did the president for that matter, through his spokesman Larry Speaks, that the greatest honor that can be paid to the 7 Americans who lost their lives today would be to go forward with the space program. To just remind you again, not that we probably need to remind you of who they are. 41-year-old Greg Jarvis, a payload specialist who is survived by his wife, Marcia. He had working on information in space, which could have been crucial to new rockets. Francis Scobie, known as Dick to everybody, the commander of the flight. He was on his second shuttle flight. He was an Air Force jet fighter pilot. He'd flown combat missions in Vietnam. He is survived by his wife, June, and 2 children. Michael Smith, though this was his first shuttle mission, he was the co-pilot, and he was 40 years old. He is survived by his wife, Jane, and his 3 children. Also trained as a test pilot, also served in Vietnam. Ronald McNair, a mission specialist. He's been up before, and he had flown, among other things, on one of the missions that had selected him as a PhD astronaut from MIT to conduct experiments in space. He'd been doing research on lasers when he was chosen. Judy Resnick, the one of 2 women on board the flight this morning. We've said it before, she was a classical pianist who also had a doctorate in electrical engineering. A unusual contrast. She's the one. And Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii, who was survived by his wife Lorna and 2 children. He was a crew member, as I think we told you once before today, on that secret Defense Department shuttle mission last January. And it goes without saying that Christa McAuliffe, the most notable member of this flight, in terms of at least the way the nation had come to know her. We said earlier, we remind you again, that it was in 1984 during the campaign when President Reagan very much surprised everybody and said that he wanted a teacher in space. And she stands out really today only, I think, probably in terms of her publicity and in terms of her challenge above the other 6 members of her crew, or to be specific, Dick Scobie's crew, who died with her. Lynn Scher, having said that, she does stand out because we got to know her so much better than the other crew members. What did you find her like?
Peter, I would like to say a word here about courage, and I think that that word applies to Christa McAuliffe as equally as it does to the rest of the crew, and indeed to all of the people who work with NASA, not only just the astronauts, but the people who put this machine together all the time. I have a copy of Christa McAuliffe's application. This is the application that she filled out to be the teacher in space. And I just want to share a few thoughts from it with you, because I think it points out not only why she was selected in what was meant to have been an exciting educational kind of expedition, but because she did obviously have a sense that there was danger. She talks about the fact, she's 37 years old, of course, and she talks about the fact that she remembered the excitement when the first satellites were launched. She was obviously just a little girl, probably in about grammar school when Sputnik first went up. And she was very caught up in the wonder of that. And she says that when Sally Ride took her first flight, she was absolutely jealous because she wanted to train as an astronaut and she couldn't do that. She couldn't start over. And when Sally and other women started to go, she said, I could see an ever-increasing list of opportunities. And then she wrote, and this is a quote from Christa McAuliffe's application to NASA, I cannot join the space program and restart my life as an astronaut, but this opportunity to connect my abilities as an educator with my interest in history and space is a unique opportunity to fulfill my early fantasies. I watched the space age being born, and I would like to participate. Very poignant, of course, but also it shows you a lot of courage. She understood, obviously, what was going on, and she wanted to be part of it. And I come back to what I said earlier. I think it is that kind of thing that has developed this country from the beginning. She was not going up there for PR. She was not going up there to become famous. She was not going up there to further her own career. She was going up there because she felt it was an important part of our lives on Earth and that you have to explore everything.
Lynn, I was watching you earlier thinking and changing your mind while on the air, so I'll do the same if you don't mind. I realize I'm treading on rather dangerous ground, delicate ground. But it seems to me that women in space have drawn more attention to the challenge of individuals in space than the original astronauts. Is that a fair comment, do you think? As from a reporter's point of view? have galvanized our interest in space more so than just another man might have. And we've now had how many women in space?
All 7, all 8, whatever it is, of the original women selected have flown, some of them twice. So, yes, I think it has galvanized our attention, but I also think the very fact that they are private citizens, regular people, not military test pilots, is what's made the difference. And there are men who have flown who have galvanized our attention quite the same way. I think that all those original arguments about why women could not fly have obviously been proven wrong. The women have done wonderfully in space, and it simply hasn't made a difference. Some of them have done better than the men. Some of them have not done as well as the men, but gender apparently has zero to do with it. So, sure, it's focused our attention on it, but I think, thank goodness, that we are beyond the point where someone will say the danger is greater to a woman than it is to a man. The danger is no greater to either one. It's an equal danger that they are all sharing, and I think that our attention being focused on Krista McAuliffe is the same thing. She was kind of the star of the mission. The astronauts admitted this will always be known as the teacher mission, and that was okay with them. It's not that we think Krista McAuliffe is any more special than any one of those other individuals. It's just that perhaps we got to know her a little bit better.
Tell me about somebody else. Tell me more about Dick Scobie, the commander of the flight. You knew him as well.
Dick Scobie, a very professional pilot. I actually met Dick for the first time when I was doing a story about Sally Ride's first flight. And Dick Scobie was, she was going out in a T-38, a practice flight, one of those jet trainers with him. And Dick was wonderful because we were obviously taking pictures of Sally, and that was Sally's month or week or year, depending on how you look at it. And I went up to him and I explained what we were trying to do, and he just very graciously said, take the pictures of her. I don't want publicity. This is not what I'm here for. And a pilot's pilot, the folks at NASA, the other astronauts, were extremely fond of him, a really wonderful person. Just some personal thoughts about some of the others. Judy Resnick, whom I know quite well. Judy worked with us at ABC during one of the missions. She was, as you have mentioned, an expert on the arm. And Judy was terrific. Again, Judy trained as an electrical engineer. All she wanted to do was go in space, fly on the shuttle, and do her thing in space. And we kind of dragged her in front of a camera and asked her to help us explain things, and she was just marvelous. I mean, she took the little model of the arm, the robot arm at which she was so expert, and she showed us exactly what it would be doing and how it was going to work, and I think helped millions of Americans understand it in a way that they might not have before. Ron McNair I knew pretty well. Ron was one of the first astronauts I ever interviewed about 6 years ago down there. And Ron was one of the examples of the new breed of astronaut that came in the class of, I believe it was 1978. They were no longer the jet pilots, the fighter pilots, the ones who were military all the way. Ron, of course, one of the first black people hired to fly as an astronaut by NASA. He was not the first of the black astronauts to go in space, but he was there, and he thought it was terribly important for blacks to be part of the space program. Also a jazz musician, as I recall. I think it was the saxophone that he used to play. A very, very special group of people.
What about Mike Smith, the co-pilot?
I didn't know Mike Smith, and I didn't know Ellison Onaduka, known as El. But he, of course, was Hawaiian, as you've pointed out, and on his last mission, which was a classified mission, he made sure that all the folks down in Mission Control had a bunch of macadamia nuts to chew on and some Hawaiian coffee. These people really take care of each other. That's a very silly little gesture that I recall, but it is true that the astronaut corps is a very close group. They don't all love each other. Some of them actually dislike each other, but it doesn't matter because they're all doing the same thing, and they are terribly dependent on one another because they all know that if somebody else does something, it could come back and affect them.
Forgive me for interrupting. On Capitol Hill, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, Congressman from Massachusetts.
Or in fiction. These wonderful people, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onaduka, Krista McAuliffe, Gregory Jarvis, died performing their duty. They died not as individuals of a crew, but working as a team, united in devotion and a commitment to the United States, their country. This afternoon, we are united in the same spirit as the crew. Oh, our deep feeling for them. We pray for these brave Americans, for their families, and for our countries. And so we're delighted that the resolution comes before us as the product of the majority leader of the House and the minority leader of the House. And it allows us to express our sentiments in this day of sorrow.
The gentleman from California.
The Speaker of the House, Congressman Tip O'Neill, commenting on the resolution which was passed in the House of Representatives earlier today, resolving that the House should express its condolences to the families of the crew members on board Challenger and resolve, which I misled you slightly, adjourn for the day as a mark of respect. I should have had the sense to tell you that everybody would want to talk to that resolution before the House finally did adjourn, but it will adjourn. And the President's State of the Union message, which he was going to give at 9 o'clock Eastern time this evening to a joint session of the House and the Senate, will now not be held for at least a week. Talk about contrast, I suppose, in a way. At a time of a mission, NASA bombards us with information. All of the telemetry, virtually every move, and you've seen us cover it for years now. Every time we have an opportunity for a television picture from the Cape or from Houston or from space, for the last almost 4 hours now, this is all that we have seen from Cape Canaveral. Just one photograph on what they call their video release system, telling us that there will be a news conference this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, at which time we hope, but we should not be wishfully hopeful, I think, at this point, to give us some more information on what happened today. Vice President Bush, as you know, has been sent by President Reagan, I'm sure without any effort whatsoever, to go to Cape Canaveral, where he is going to talk to and console on behalf of the President and therefore on behalf of the official family of the first family of the nation, accompanied by John Glenn, who you just saw, and Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who just walked across in front of your picture. And though I don't recognize him by sight, that may be Congressman Bill Nelson from Florida as well. We're going to go with the Vice President to console the family members in Florida. Sam Donaldson is standing by at the White House. Sam, does the Vice President have any other particular brief with him?
Well, the Vice President, of course, is going to head the first look from the White House's standpoint at what went wrong today. He's not leading an investigation, as we heard Larry Speake say, but he is going to take a look at the first amount of information that NASA has and report back to the President.
Sam, the President has put off his State of the Union, as we've said a number of times now. Do you know when it's going to happen, A? And B, is he going to talk to the nation tonight?
Well, it's going to happen a week from today. That's what Press Secretary Speake said. He is going to speak from the Oval Office for about 5 minutes, sometime a little later today, but it's not scheduled as a prime-time speech, Peter. As soon as NASA holds its news conference, about 3:30 Eastern Time, the White House is going to gear up, and perhaps in the next hour or two after that, the President will deliver a very short 5-minute speech.
But the President, the Vice President, Sam, is clearly going to the Cape as a mark of respect rather than as a member of his investigating team, right?
Well, that's his first thing. Maybe I misunderstood you when you said, does he have any other brief or a brief? I thought perhaps you meant, does he have any other duties when he went down there?
No, if you misunderstood me, it's probably at this point, Sam, because I misspoke. Any changes at the White House now in the last few hours?
No, I think now everything is in a routine after they've made this decision to cancel the State of the Union. As you know, first, Peter, the President was inclined to go ahead. In fact, in talking to reporters, I said to him, but it will cast a pall over your speech tonight, which is going to be an upbeat speech if you deliver it. He said, yes, that's true, but you can't stop governing the nation. But after he went back into the Oval Office, I'm told that almost everyone, including the President, thought about it a little bit and unanimously decided they couldn't go ahead with this speech, that to do so would be misunderstood completely and would be totally out of place.
Sam, does the President have any passionate personal interest in space, such as, for example, John Kennedy had?
No, there's no evidence that Mr. Reagan has any interest such as that in space. He's followed it as most laymen have, and of course as president he's had to pass on appropriations and things like that, but he doesn't refer to it often. He has not pushed it in speeches throughout the years. It is clearly not one of his top priorities.
I heard one reporter at a White House briefing we heard earlier with our speaks asking whether or not this was going to have any effect on the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars program. I assume that was just a question, was it?
Well, I assume it was, because, in fact, whenever he delivers his State of the Union message a week from today, as I say, he has a line in there, once again, saying that we must have the Strategic Defense Initiative and that he intends to pursue it. So he feels very strongly about that, and he's going to say so in his State of the Union message.
Sometimes the White House does feel, or the administration appears to feel, Sam, as if events, just events in the abstract sense, and this would qualify as one, gets, in a sense, in the way of the White House agenda. As you said, the President was very up for the State of the Union this evening. Any sense of that at all?
Well, I think people here are always cognizant of events as they take place and impact on the President's agenda, on his speeches, and on his schedule. Many times in the Reagan administration, we've seen events bring the President out all right. I can't help but remember that awful Sunday when 240-some-odd Marines were blown up in their barracks in Lebanon. Everyone was appalled by that, and there was a great hue and cry that commenced. But 2 days later, the President invaded Grenada and carried out a very successful mission there that the nation applauded. And that event, you see, sort of overrode the first event. So everyone that I've seen in this office, Peter, is to an extent captured by events. They cannot control them. When the Arab nations that produce oil, as you recall, in the Persian Gulf, were able to raise the world oil prices by 100% in 1979, Jimmy Carter sat in that office. Well, it wasn't his fault that that happened, but he took it on the chin when the inflationary ripple ran through the world economy. Under Mr. Reagan, OPEC has almost dissolved. It has fallen apart, largely to an extent because of measures put into force in the world for energy conservation and because of a recession.
We have asked a number of people, Sam, as to whether or not this tragedy today might detract from NASA or give it something of a boost. What's your own sense in terms of the President's attitude?
Well, my own sense is, to use the phrase the President himself used to us, life goes on. There will be an investigation. There will be a halt to the space shuttle program until NASA is certain it knows the cause and that it can safely launch another space shuttle. But my hunch is that the program will go on. Clearly, we're going to explore space. Clearly, the space program is simply going to expand far beyond our lifetimes. And it's not going to stop because of this tragedy today.
Sam, we have not heard from Mrs. Reagan, and Larry Speaks, the White House spokesman, said he'd try to elicit a comment for us. Have you managed to get one?
Mrs. Reagan was in the East Wing, where her offices are, just on the other side of the White House mansion, as you know, from the President's offices in the West Wing. And she knew about this immediately, and it was flashed on television. And we are told by our press secretary that she said, "Oh, God." And they called over immediately from the West Wing to see if she was watching, and she was, in fact, watching. Beyond that, I have no reaction from her.
Sam, thank you very much for joining us. I confess we're not going to let you get too far away today, but we are going to tell you that the news conference, which NASA had told us it was going to have at 3:30, is now going to be delayed until 4 o'clock. And that is the Vice President's plane leaving Andrews Air Force Base to go to Florida. The Vice President, the man in the political hierarchy in this country who is always sent on such missions. Never have asked him individually how he feels to spend as much time as he does in various parts of the world expressing the condolences and carrying with him the official public sadness of the American people as well as the administration, but he does a great deal of it. And though this is clearly not an occasion for it, when he was shuttling back and forth to the Soviet Union with the death of successive Soviet leaders, it even became a subject of some jokes. But he does not go on a mission today, clearly, that is any joking matter. Just to remind you that NASA, on whose first word, almost, we all hang, is now not going to give its news conference until 4 o'clock Eastern Time, which is about 32 minutes from now. I cannot tell you with any certainty that tells us anything. But everything we have come to understand today, from the White House, from John Quinones at the Cape, from Lim Schur, who's been working in the phones from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California, from Gene Cernan, the astronaut who's been talking to us, is that the only information they will have at this moment, certainly by the time they hold this news conference this afternoon, is that which is based on the telemetry, the data, which is communicated back to Houston Mission Control as we saw it. I think it was Gene Cernan who said, when I asked Lynn Sherr about black boxes similar to those on commercial aircraft, that we all saw the black box. We all heard the information as it was relayed back in the public arena by voice communication and by the various other means that they monitor on board the spacecraft itself. That's the only way at this point they will know or not know what has been going on high over the Atlantic. Out in the search area itself, the Pentagon has sent out a number of recovery ships to look in what I guess everyone now believes is the vain hope that there will have been a survivor. Remember, they were 10 miles up, and if you've been with us for much of the day, you will have heard us said before that there was no escape capsule on board the shuttle. There was an earlier one on the Columbia very early on, but none of the other 3 space shuttles, there are 4, which were being used in rotation for the 15 missions planned this year. None of the others have an escaped craft or escaped capsule on them. And again, I defer to Gene Cernan, the Apollo astronaut who's been so helpful to us today, to say that looking as he has done time and time again at the explosion which occurred about 2 minutes and 10 seconds after liftoff, that even if there had been an escape capsule, it would not have been much help. At any rate, out in the recovery area, about somewhere between 8 and 20 and perhaps even farther miles off the coast of Florida and Cape Canaveral, the U.S. Navy has a couple of hydrofoils out and a frigate. The Coast Guard has sent out a couple of cutters, and there are helicopters in the area as well as a C-130, all doing a sea and aerial search at the moment, obviously as their prime goal for some sense of the crew, but certainly for the debris as a result of this overwhelming explosion, which occurred at almost 2,000 miles an hour, so that they can begin to painstakingly put the pieces together as Vice President Bush leaves Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington to go off to Cape Canaveral with very much the same questions in mind as everyone else in the nation must have at the moment. What happened after those, what surely will become well-remembered words? Roger, go, throttle up. The last words we heard from the mission control communicator, the commander on the ground, saying that they could go to full power to give it that last boost, the Space Shuttle Challenger, toward its orbit.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
You're watching a videotape of what happened shortly after 11:30 this morning Eastern Time.
257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This is what television viewers have come to recognize now as super slow-mo or super slow motion. And there you see the flare, at least at that speed that we referred to earlier, the beginning of the explosion, which appears to be occurring somewhere in the area between the main tank and the outboard solid fuel tanks. And as Gene Cernan, former astronaut Gene Cernan has said to us, occurred within, he thought, microseconds, engulfing the actual space shuttle itself. That parachute, which gave us such hope earlier this morning, has subsequently been described to us as some member of a rescue operation or presumed rescue operation going into the Atlantic off the Cape. It was the sight of that parachute some hours ago, 5 hours ago, 4 hours ago,
with recovery forces
in which the nation, on which the nation hung for a considerable length of time before the realization really began to sink in that the possibilities of surviving an explosion with all of this force at 2,000 miles an hour were pretty remote. Again, this really more for people who may just have joined us than for those of you who've been with us for some time. This is what it looked like. These are the two solid fuel rockets which we've now become accustomed to falling off and subsequently recovered in the Atlantic. And this is this enormous main fuel tank from which, and forgive me if you've heard me say it before, from which, had there been any warning, the shuttle could have disengaged itself and perhaps got free. And there is no remote indication today from any quarter of the land, official or unofficial, that has actually happened today. We do learn at the moment that while the space agency, NASA, was ready to hold its news conference 5 minutes ago, there appears to be some hang-up with the White House. So if somebody's listening, and perhaps they could give us some indication there what the hang-up is. Before this launch went off, I guess it wasn't paid any closer attention to than by the folks in New Hampshire. That was where Krista McAuliffe was the so popular, so practical teacher. And today at the high school, where she had so many fans and so many friends, there was an absolutely celebratory atmosphere before the launch occurred this morning. You will recall that they'd all hoped it was going to go off yesterday, and had been quite disappointed and in some instances quite indignant that it hadn't gone off, but there was a problem with a hatch door yesterday. And then this morning the weather was good, even though there'd been some icing overnight, and the weather had been good both at the pad and 20,000 feet where they'd had some very severe wind yesterday, and they settled in this morning to watch their teacher go into space.
Looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
And the transformation in Concord from joy and pride to shock and to sadness, reflected all over the nation today. We're joined now by the Reverend Jesse Jackson. We are joined on tape by the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who knew one of the astronauts on board and, like so many people this morning who had some connection with the space community, simply wanted to say something about it.
Our prayers and deepest sympathies go out to the family and friends of the 7 astronauts who perished in the explosion of the space shuttle today. Ronald McNair was a personal friend of mine and a fellow alumnus from North Carolina A&T State University. We recently shared the platform together at A&T, where I was the commencement speaker, and he received an honorary doctorate degree. And thus, in addition to the tragic loss of the other 6, Ron McNair's loss is very personal. As a board member of A&T, the whole educational community in Greensboro, North Carolina, is grief-stricken and in mourning. And this crisis is another sign from heaven to remind us that ultimately our faith in God, not our faith in technology, is the only thing that we can count on to sustain us. While we may not understand the meaning of this crisis, we are sustained by our faith that God never makes a mistake. From the depths of our pain, agony, and sorrow, we are taught that suffering may endure for a night, but if we hold on, joy will come in the morning. Let each of us bow our heads and join our hands in the moment of prayer. Shall we stand?
The Reverend Jesse Jackson talking about Ron McNair, who was one of the 7 members on board this morning, bringing to a total of 10 Americans who have died in the space program. Tragedy today, but in terms of the overall space program, with the deaths of 7 today, we come to a total of 10. It has been 19 years and 1 day since the 3 astronauts, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom, I apologize, died while they were still strapped in their capsule on the pad at Cape Canaveral. And it was Gus Grissom who said at the time, I guess something very much along the lines you've been hearing today, which was you have faith in the program, you have faith in the machinery that is designed to take you into space, you strap yourself in, and you still fly. And parallel to the sadness today that has been felt by people all across the country at this loss of 7 Americans who have challenged the reaches far beyond the imagination even of many of us, comes this public support, at least, particularly from people who have a deep involvement with the space program, of America's mission, capital M, in space. And it's ironic in some respects, and certainly a contrast, that it comes at a time when America is similarly celebrating the overwhelming success, far beyond the imagination of its early planners, of Voyager 2, the little spacecraft that could, as some people have called it this week, which has been plotting its way or plodding its way through the heavens now for 8.5 years, and in the last week and a half has given us some quite extraordinary pictures of Uranus, the farthest and the closest man has been. That, of course, an unmanned spacecraft, which will now go on, in fact, is in the process now of going on past Uranus and ultimately will go out into the heavens, which I'm sure is a phrase scientists don't like, with that gold phonograph record on it carrying messages including whale language, lest there be other inhabitants out there somewhere. So while we all share in this tragedy today of the loss of individuals and the setback to the space program, it is worthwhile, I hope you think, in remembering that America's success in space at the moment is also being proven by the overwhelming success, as I said, of Voyager 2. Lynn Scher, who has been out, in fact, in California at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to monitor Voyager 2 for us, has been her challenge this week, has also, while we've been on the air working the telephones to the various mission controls. Lynn, simple question again, anything?
Well, I've been talking to a number of people, Peter, and first of all, nobody knows anything yet. I just spoke to another one of the former astronauts from the shuttle program who, without knowing anything, thinks that it might have been a rupture of some kind that caused the tank to ignite. In other words, maybe one of the fuel lines leading into the engines of the tank, engines of the shuttle, excuse me. It seems clear that both solid rocket boosters were thrown free or were pushed aside and went to their own destination, still, as you can see or as you will see in just a few seconds, almost intact, or intact. They have to be intact. Almost intact wouldn't mean anything. Just take a look at that. What we're looking at is obviously a still frame, and that's the flame starting. And if there were a rupture on the tank, you're looking at the shuttle on the right. Let me do it with the model, if I may. Here's the shuttle. That's the view that you were looking at. I think was actually probably that way. Is that right? And if the shuttle is on its back, and the tank is here, and the boosters are on the side, as you've showed us so many times, the boosters seem to have gotten away. Let's take a look at that tape, and we'll look at it again. The boosters seem to get away okay, which may mean that the rupture was in a fuel line in the tank. Now, look at that flame right there. If we could stop that tape, if that's possible. The flame is at the base, the bottom of the external tank. That's where the fuel would go into the shuttle's main engines. And that appears to be the first flame. Is it, in fact, the first flame? Obviously, I don't know. Okay, let's roll a little bit more, and what you'll see will happen as it keeps going. The flame then, obviously, that very thin-skinned external tank with all that liquid hydrogen and oxygen is so volatile, so flammable, is just going to go. Keep going. And as the flame appears to be spreading, now the whole tank will go, but the boosters get thrown free. And then, as Peter, you pointed out a number of times, they just go sent off in the wrong direction, but they are not exploding in any way. What we're talking about, obviously, that orange blob in the middle, the long sort of pencil-looking, I'm sorry, the long fat pencil, the crayon, is the external tank. And if that ruptures, then the boosters, those two white crayons on the side, would simply be sent on their way the wrong way, and they would go until they fizzle out, and then they go down into the ocean, and they're supposed to be recovered for another mission.
Well, Lynn, here's a note for you. We've had a report from Cape Canaveral that they found bits of the booster rockets. Now, is that normal? I thought they could be recovered intact.
You're quite right. It is not normal. They should be recovered intact because they do get reused. But there you see on the right what appears to be a perfectly normal rocket burn. Again, going the wrong direction. It's supposed to be attached to the shuttle and heading up or heading out. Instead, it appears to be heading down. But there does not appear to be any kind of I repeat, appear to be anything unusual about that. If there were an explosion within the tank, as we're speculating, it is possible that it could have affected a piece of one of the boosters, which may account for why there are pieces of the boosters. But I don't want to take this too far because it's dangerous without really knowing what happened.
Well,
but Peter, you're entirely right that if they find pieces of a booster, obviously the booster did not make it intact.
Well, I would like you to ask one question, and I couldn't agree with you more that getting too deep. We've only got about 15 minutes before NASA promises they're going to come and tell us something. But one of the European scientists, Mike Lee, told us earlier this morning, it's speculated that the bad weather at the Cape, particularly the cold, that Arctic wind that pushed down right into the deep south in the last couple of days, may have had some effect on the main tank. Is that a consideration, at least?
Sure, has to be. Everything has to be a consideration because this has never happened before. So everything has to be taken into account.
Well, how about normal circumstances?
I saw the same pictures as you did this morning with the icicles surrounding the shuttle. The shuttle is not used to that, and in the past they've had a problem. They're worried that the ice is going to knock against the tiles during liftoff and maybe hurt some of the tiles. It was my understanding that they had teams in there knocking those icicles off so that they would be away from the fuel line so that there could not be a problem. I don't know. Yes, of course you have to take everything into consideration.
I must tell you one other thing, which is a report only from Cape Canaveral, and it's really talking about the people on the search teams now, who've been out for a couple of hours to say that while they found bits of the booster rockets, they have found no signs of life. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us. To remind you that this was the 10th flight for Challenger and the 25th of the entire shuttle program. And in this city, and it may be a reflection of what you're asking yourselves all over the country today, it has certainly been raised by those people we heard from in Western Europe, but that's in part because they have an unmanned space program, the efficacy of sending civilians or man into space generally. It has always been, in contrast to the Soviet space program for a long period of time, much more ambitious manned program. You will recall back in the 1950s when Sputnik, that thing the size of a grapefruit, orbited around and sent this nation into something of a deep shock, particularly the administration. It was determined to get ahead of the Soviets in the space program. And it was really that which led in large measure to the emergence of the Mercury astronauts, people like John Glenn and Alan Shepard, who we saw this morning, who 25 years later became American heroes a second time round when they became the subject of a very highly popular, I wouldn't say altogether highly popular, but certainly highly publicized movie called The Right Stuff. And on Capitol Hill today, as you heard Charlie Gibson say, and you've seen Jake Garr, the senator who's flown, and Senator John Glenn, very much in contrast to those critics of the space administration who want things to slow down in a drastic way. Lynn, if you had to make a guess at this point, and I realize it only is a guess, would you think, based on your association with politics and space, that the space program would have a serious slowdown?
A serious slowdown, Peter?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question. I mean, after the fire, it was, 18 months before things got back on track. I think this is going to be a very serious slowdown. But I think it is also true that they will do their investigation, that they will find out what they think happened, and that they will surmount it. I cannot imagine in any way, shape, or form that this is the end of the American manned space program. They've got a lot of work to do, but having done it, they will then be better for it, sadder for it, wiser for it. But sure, it's going to go on. But yes, indeed, it will be a terrible setback.
What does it do to the American...
Plan for the...
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, you please go ahead.
I was just going to say, the missions planned for this year alone, NASA's been building up to this. These were very, very important in terms of space science. and in terms of American technology, and in terms of what the space program wanted to be. Part of this year's program was to prove that they could just go ahead and do it. And, of course, that's all stopped now.
What does it do to the American space program competitively? There are competitors out there, certainly in terms of the shuttle mission. They're the unmanned spacecraft in Europe. What does it do to us competitively?
Well, if again, let us just purely speculate. If the American space program is on hold for 6 months or a year, and I don't know that that's what's going to happen, then somebody who needs a satellite lifted up there sooner rather than later might want to go to one of the competitors. It is not clear to me that there is space available on any of those unmanned competitors for immediate launch. They have their backups as well. The Ariane spacecraft has not lifted off perfectly every single time. They've had their accidents. Luckily, they don't have people on board. It hasn't been quite as tragic as today. But the Chinese have had problems. They've got spacecraft going up. So sure, NASA could very well lose some business if there is room available on other rockets going up, and if it is so important to the people who need their satellites or whatever launched that they will choose to go somewhere else. Could be a terrible setback.
I hope you won't mind a family remark, but now I know why you cover space for us. Lynn, thank you very much. We'll get back to you. We said earlier that this is really an international crisis or an international ordeal, because it isn't just America in any way, shape, or form that has been affected by this today. I think we mentioned a number of times before in the time we've been on that the Soviets were among the very first to express their condolences to the families of the 7 astronauts on board without any other public indication except sheer sadness, the Soviets being not only aggressive competitors in space, but a nation very deeply involved in space, with something of the same link between the Soviet public and the space program in terms of admiration that has existed in America for so long. And there, of course, has been reaction elsewhere. I want to go back now to ABC's Mike Lee, who's in London.
The British public first learned of the shuttle tragedy through late afternoon TV news bulletins.
The space shuttle explodes just after takeoff. All 7 on board are feared dead.
The Space Shuttle Challenger has exploded and disintegrated shortly after takeoff. It was carrying a crew of 7, including a woman teacher, and there are no reports of any survivors. Reaction on the streets is one of disbelief and shock.
Horrific, yeah, sure. It's absolutely terrible.
I'm just shocked. I was, just come in and
I want to ask you 2 things.
I'm quite amazed about it. Speechless, really.
And there is a statement from the 4 British astronauts due to join the U.S. Space Shuttle program on future missions. We are saddened by the tragic loss of life at Kennedy Space Center, and our deepest sympathy is extended to the wives and families of the shuttle crew. At this moment, says the British astronaut statement, the full circumstances are not known. Therefore, its impact on the Skynet 4 program cannot be determined. Throughout this country, as indeed throughout the world, people were standing by their TV sets, in homes, offices, and in pubs for the latest news. In the Soviet Union, the news was announced by TASS and dispatched from New York. And Soviet TV tonight carried pictures of the tragedy from Florida.
And, of course, the reaction has extended even farther and wider than that. Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, reported from Washington on this crash. It's been reported in virtually every part of the world, which says, A, obviously something about the tragedy, but B, something about America and space. And as we were talking with Mike Lee in London earlier today, it is the kind of thing which evokes enormous sympathy for America in other parts of the world, no matter what those people in some other parts of the world think of America in an overall way. And so it is very much a shared ordeal. Charlie Gibson earlier was talking about Congressman George Brown's comments on Capitol Hill, and he in fact is now on Capitol Hill with the congressman himself. Charles?
Peter, we were talking earlier about Congressman Brown and his comments involving what this may have to do in the long run with the shuttle program and what effects it may have. As I mentioned earlier, I think every member's reactions first have been to the human side of this question, but then there are inevitable questions about what will follow. Congressman, what do you think in the long run this will do to the shuttle program?
Well, obviously there are a number of important repercussions. For example, we may lose considerable commercial launch business as a result of this, partly because we won't be able to maintain the schedule that we have tried to establish for launch of communication satellites and things of that sort. The remaining shuttle capacity, now reduced by the loss of this orbiter, will have to give a higher priority to the military launches, which reduces the amount of available space for commercial launches.
Well, Congressman, you know more probably about the militarization of space and the military use of space than anybody around here, and the Air Force has been quite a critic of the shuttle program, hasn't it? And what do you think this will do in the long run to the military's use of the shuttle program?
Well, the military's taken a position that they need reliability and that they can get better reliability with unmanned launches, and they have been pressuring to maintain an unmanned launch capability. I think that this will strengthen their case for greater reliance upon the unmanned launches. At the same time as it causes us to lose some of the commercial business. From a financial standpoint, it may have a serious adverse impact upon the whole shuttle program.
Do you think there's a possibility the military would pull out on its use of the shuttle?
Well, they've tried to do that in the past, but as a matter of national policy, I think we've wanted to keep them utilizing the shuttle because we want to make the shuttle as viable as possible. In other words, we want to give it a full load as often as we can.
So you think Congress will urge the military to stay in the program, but that there may be another look at using unmanned as opposed to manned shots for military uses?
Well, I think this applies particularly to the commercial communication satellites. We're in competition with the French, for example, to launch those. The French use an unmanned vehicle, and I think they're going to pick up business as a result of this failure. There is some potential positive impact in the fact that this may cause us to move ahead to a next generation shuttle a little more rapidly than we have before. In other words, instead of building a fifth orbiter, which we've been considering, we might step up our efforts to develop a direct Earth-to-space plane, which is under serious consideration at the present time.
How about effects on the space station? That has been a major effort of the president's. Do you think it could have some repercussions in that area?
There's no question about it. The space station, as a result of this accident and also as a result of budgetary considerations, may be set back as much as 3 or 4 years now.
In the long run, what effect do you think this has?
From WTVN-TV, this is an Action 6 News Brief.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this national report, but we'll return in just a moment. However, we do wish to remind you this national tragedy is having a definite impact on us here in Central Ohio. We're going to have a reaction from one of the Ohio teachers who was in the space program who could very well have been aboard that ill-fated flight. We'll also be talking with a local expert on the shuttle and discuss what might have gone wrong this morning. We'll have reaction from people who are watching the space shuttle explosion, other reaction from Ohio Senator John Glenn, and all the very latest news on this national tragedy right here. It'll be coming up on Action 6 News, but right now we return to ABC News.
Oh, this whole matter is going to have to be rethought, and it may call for a reconfiguration of our space transportation system and the whole shuttle program.
All right, Congressman Brown, thank you very much. Peter, as we talked about earlier, an awful lot of questions still to be answered, and it's very early to be asking them, and obviously the reaction up here is still very human, but those questions already being addressed and will be in considerable measure over the next few weeks. I suspect that after Congress comes back from the George Washington birthday holiday, there will be considerable hearings on the issue, both as to the cause of this tragedy today and where the space program goes from here. Peter?
Well, Charlie, in listening to you, I understand wholeheartedly what you say about the people's feelings up there, but the political reality of $1 billion to replace a shuttle, et cetera, and military use of manned or unmanned rockets is clearly part of the political reality. But this is a day for us and for everybody across the nation to think primarily of 7 Americans searching for the heavens who lost their lives. There is surely no doubt. And they are, as you look at them, Gregory Jarvis, who was the payload specialist, 41 years old. He was an engineer with the Hughes Aircraft Corporation. He was on this flight of Challenger to test the effects of weightlessness on fluids carried in tanks. Greg Jarvis. Francis, or Dick Scobie, who was the commander of the flight, making his second shuttle flight. A pilot who flew innumerable combat missions in Vietnam. A man of 47, 46 years old, of the Vietnam pilot generation. Mike Smith, who was his co-pilot, who was 40. It was his first mission today, his first shuttle flight, I should say. He was also trained as a test pilot, which, of course, all the early astronauts were trained as test pilots, and he saw combat on missions in Vietnam. Ronald McNair, of whom you heard the Reverend Jesse Jackson speak, and also Lynn Scher, a very popular member of the crew. He was a mission specialist. He became an astronaut in 1979, and this was actually his second shuttle mission. And he was not by any means the first black American to fly, but he was one of the first black Americans chosen to be part of the astronaut program as it got broader and wider. Judy Resnick, of whom Lynn Scher spoke so warmly. You cover people like this as a reporter, you invariably become friends. Judy was a concert pianist, had a doctorate in electrical engineering, and as Lynn Scher told us earlier, all she ever wanted to do was to fly in space. Ellison Onizuka, who used to bring the macadamia nuts to Cape Canaveral, one of the great advertisements from the state of Hawaii. Onizuka was a Hawaiian, and he is survived by his wife and 2 children. And Krista McAuliffe, who inevitably will always be known as the teacher in space, and of whom Dick Scobie, the commander, said he never resented, it was her turn, it was her publicity, she represented something, not just for the space program, but for the nation. And these are her parents, who had gone to Cape Canaveral this morning with such a sense of pride, and who learned, as we all learned, of the tragedy which occurred on the 10th flight of the Challenger. Now, the President has decided that he would like to speak to the nation about 5 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time from the Oval Office. At least that is the word we have. It is now a little after 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and that is the time that NASA at the Kennedy Space Center has told us they will come and speak to us, at least attempt to brief us in the person of Jesse Moore, who is the Associate Administrator for the space program, to give us some inclination of what they know, if they know anything, about what went on today when the Challenger suddenly exploded and blew up 10 miles above Cape Canaveral. We don't know how much they know, and the White House at this point, at least as it has communicated to us, doesn't appear to know what actually went on, and we have said to you a number of times today just how much information they will have had. We have heard as much as Mission Control heard. They will have seen many other things through their telemetry, but this is a much awaited news conference today, and then the President, who has canceled his State of the Union message, which he was going to deliver to a joint session of the House and the Senate tonight, delayed it for a week. The President is going to have something to say to the nation about 5 o'clock this afternoon. We are certainly going to stay on the air through this very important NASA news conference. It is a little more than 4 hours and 15 minutes now since this accident occurred, and I don't think there is one of us, if you've been with us all this time, there's certainly no one here who hasn't waited for this one word from NASA, because they are the people who will know if they know anything. And that's the only thing we are getting from NASA at this point. And they do say, at least the Air Force, to be more specific, which has been part of the search, and one would always still hope rescue mission, out in the area where the rocket fell down, that debris being spotted is from the solid rocket booster that is being collected. The water out there is between 100 and 200 feet deep. Now, an intact shuttle, this reusable spacecraft, is designed to float, and it will float, but there's no indication in any way, shape, or form that this shuttle is intact. We perhaps, again, if you've just sort of joined us or been with us for a while, we've been on the air for a little more than 4 hours now, how people around the country have reacted. And one of the first and one of the most eloquent, because he was there, was Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who is one of the political overseers of the NASA program, but who flew on the shuttle. And here is how he reacted earlier today.
It's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
This has been a terrible setback in a program that the United States has put so much into. We were supporting our intentions by continuing to accelerate the pace of manned flight. And I think it's going to cause a tremendous amount of re-examination before we take the risk, which is associated with this and certainly borne home today, of this kind of a program.
And it's been an extraordinarily, viable program, and this is just a tragic thing. So I really don't have any detail on it.
When did the president...
Except the motion, saw the president, was in there to help tell him about it, and then went in afterward to see him, and his concerns are the same for the families and everybody else involved in all of this.
This is a day we've managed to avoid for a quarter of a century. It's a day we've talked about before and speculated on, and it finally has arrived. We hope we could push this day back forever. But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today.
John Glenn and others expressing their sentiments about this tragedy today as we watch that one, in great contrast to what we usually get from NASA, this one signal telling us that the news conference will begin momentarily, as something of an aside and about the power of the space program in terms of the public imagination, in terms of personality, campaigning with John Glenn during the '84 campaign. Some of you may recall he actually decided he wanted to run for president, and while I mean no political disrespect to him at all, you would wander through places with John Glenn all those years after he became the first American to orbit the Earth in the Mercury program. Gemini or Mercury? Mercury, thank you. In the Mercury program, all those years ago, and he was running for president, and people would stand. I remember once being in a shopping center with him, I think in Iowa, and people would stand there, and they never saw him, a great many people, as a political candidate, much to his regret and the regret of his staff, obviously. But they always saw him as the astronaut. And people would bring their children up to John Glenn and introduce their children who had been named after John Glenn, because his exploits in space had so captured the imagination of those of us who are so earthbound. And so it is with the people who continue to explore space. We talked to Lynn Scher a little while ago about the new dimension of imagination that has been captured in the land with the advent of women in space. And now that it has been firmly and clearly established that it is no more dangerous for a woman in space than it is for a man, as has been proved in past shuttle missions, there's been that other dimension. One personal note, if you'll forgive me, I have a daughter who has only one autographed picture, not of her father, it's of Sally Ride. Some indications of how across the land the public connection with astronauts, even when we get blasé about it, brings about the kind of response which has been evoked across the land and around the world today in terms of an American space tragedy. And it reminds us, too, of the only other space tragedy in terms of loss of life, which was back in 1967, when 3 astronauts lost their lives on the pad before they had a chance to lift off from Cape Canaveral. It was then Cape Kennedy and became Cape Canaveral again. We wait now for NASA and the deputy administrator, the associate administrator at NASA, Jesse Moore, to tell us what, if anything, they know. Perhaps we could review it for you just one more time before that news conference begins. The Challenger like Columbia, which had flown just before it, had a lot of sort of temporary setbacks. Columbia, if I recall correctly, had been delayed 6 times before its last mission. One thing small, nothing always of an enormous nature. There's been a lot of discussion today about whether NASA was pushing too hard because of the commercial benefits to the Space Shuttle program. Most people we've talked to today who know something about NASA and have had a closer connection with it at least have tended to say they've been ultra-conservative. So after numerous delays with Columbia, there were again delays with Challenger, the most recent 24, 48 hours ago, with a door that wouldn't close. And then there was problem with weather at 20,000 feet and weather over the Cape. And then this morning with that clear blue sky of the Atlantic, with which Floridians at least are so familiar, the 7-man crew went to Challenger, got on board, strapped themselves in, and off they went. Here's what happened.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now.
Clearly see
at 94%.
Eastern Standard Time.
Throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
When the 10th flight for Challenger
65% shortly
began, and it drove towards orbit with everything absolutely normal.
Running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Well, there are no more words required to describe to you what happened today. There cannot be anyone in the country today who does not have some sense, who does perhaps not rush to their television set to witness either for the first time or on the many times since that you've had a chance to see it, what actually happened there today. We do have one little piece that we've talked a little bit earlier today about speculation. Dr. Max Faget, who is the head of the team that designed the shuttle and who does not work for NASA now, said he does not believe that anything about the cause of the explosion can be discerned on these tapes that we have been seeing on the air. And he says that based on what he has been seeing on television, there isn't any evidence that would help us pinpoint the cause of the explosion. It's very important because, in part because we have perhaps been on the air for some considerable period of time, there has been a tendency to speculate a little. So I just want to quote Dr. Faget there, who was one of the team that designed the shuttle. He does not believe that anything about the cause of the explosion can be discerned from any of the tapes that have been playing on the air. ABC's Lynn Scher at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or out in California at least, not at the Jet Propulsion Lab. Yes, Lynn?
Peter, I also just got some information about Max Faget, coincidentally, and it's my information that he has said he simply has no idea. He, of course, being a man largely responsible for designing the shuttle. I wanted to add a couple of things, and it's along the same line. We've talked about, let's narrow it down, the 3 possibilities that could have caused this thing. 1, that was one of the solid rocket boosters. 2, that it was one of the main engines. Let me show you on the model. Perhaps it was one of the 2 solid rocket boosters. Perhaps it was a main engine that simply let go and caused the fire, or perhaps it was the external tank itself that ruptured. I think the important thing to keep in mind, it has been pointed out to me, is that this was so catastrophic that it is probably not an engineering problem, i.e., these structures just don't fall apart like that, or they're certainly not meant to. There is no history to indicate that they would do that. Yes, we have seen that flame at about the midpoint or the lower third of the tank. Whether the flame started there and there was a rupture in the tank or a fuel line, that caused it, or whether, in fact, that's a secondary reaction from an explosion in one of the engines or somewhere else. We simply don't know. And I think the quote you were reading from Dr. Faget is obviously to the point. One
Lynn,
final note. Yeah.
He also does say, having said that he can't see anything on the tape, he also say the flame observed between the shuttle and the external tank could be a fire inside the shuttle burning through the skin. Has anybody else suggested that to you?
Nobody has suggested that to me. That is one area that I haven't heard of. But the flames, sure, it could have started anywhere, but there are flames around the engine. There are flames around the edges of the solid rocket boosters. There is enough heat generated there that if any of the liquid hydrogen or oxygen were to escape from the main tank, that would obviously cause that kind of explosion. The only good news in all of this, and it's not such good news, but it may be helpful news, let's call it that, was pointed out to me that there is no time during a shuttle flight when there is more telemetry than during the ascent phase. In other words, while the shuttle is going up at exactly the time that it exploded, reams of material is coming down and going into the monitors and onto tapes and everything down at Mission Control in Florida and in Houston. If there is a way to analyze that data, they have a shot at it, because they have just about every bit of information that they need to know already in their memory banks.
Well, what's your own sense? Can they do it fast enough to satisfy a clearly anxious nation?
I don't think so, no. I think that it's going to be, a long time. I just spoke to another former shuttle astronaut who pointed out that this is such a stunning blow to the space program. Who knows when they will be able to figure it out.
Lynn, thank you very much indeed. I just want to go back to Dr. Faget again, who has emerged at a very useful time. If we could look once again at the picture, not so much of the explosion, but afterwards, we may be able to be slightly more helpful with, from an educational point of view, because the white cloud after the explosion, we want to go actually a little farther ahead of this. The point that Dr. Faget is making is that liquid hydrogen explodes so quickly in contact with the air that in his view it's unlikely to be a leak in the external tank, and those are the external tanks that we saw subsequently going off into space. And it has such a... We are still waiting for NASA, which told us the news conference was going to occur at 4:15 Eastern Time. It is now 4:17. We've been talking about loss, and clearly the most important and pertinent and immediate loss today is of the 7 people on board. NASA not only loses a shuttle, which you heard Congressman George Brown describe at worth something slightly in excess of $1 billion, but also lost is a $100 million satellite that was to become an important part of NASA's shuttle communications network. And there was a smaller $10 million payload on board that was part of an experiment to study Halley's Comet, which, as you know, has now gone behind the sun and is not going to be seen, if it's seen at all, by many people in the country until sometime in March. To connect us with the rest of the world again, here is ABC's Mike Lee in London. Mike?
Well, Peter, as you might imagine, there are reactions coming in officially and unofficially. The latest we have is from the Queen herself, and I'll read it verbatim. Prince Philip and I were shocked and saddened by the news from Cape Canaveral. The wonderful story of the space shuttle and its many spectacular successes have left us full of admiration. It is tragic that this success has taken its price in brave young lives. Our sympathy goes especially to their families, but also to you and to all Americans. Elizabeth R., which of course is Queen Elizabeth II. Further reaction from the Republic of Ireland, where the Prime Minister Garret Fitzgerald has expressed his sympathy and shock, and has added that we are all deeply appalled by the accident, but equally we are convinced it will not discourage America with pushing forward with the space program. A note of perhaps irony, but perhaps worth mentioning as a connection to London, and I think people over here will use this to further their feeling of closeness to the American people tonight. Miss McAuliffe's life was insured for $1 million through Lloyd's of London. That insurance policy, we are given to understand, was donated from an American company and arranged here, Lloyd's of London. It's certainly of little consequence to her family, but something that the people over here will, of course, take note of.
Mike, thank you very much, and reaction comes clearly also from north of the border. The Canadians have long had an interest in the American space program. A Canadian astronaut has already flown on board the shuttle. He's a Canadian naval officer. I've forgotten his name. I'm sorry to say. But he's become something of a national hero in Canada as well as he travels back and forth across the nation, getting the same kind of treatment from young school children in Canada that astronauts get in this country. And of course, Canada has the great arm on board the shuttle, which has been so useful that Lynn Sure described to us so accurately before. The Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, when he heard the news this morning, called up the American ambassador right away, and then there was a minute of silence in the Canadian House of Commons in Ottawa. Again, all of this, we tell you, not only to report the news that is going on, but simply to illustrate, again, just how extensively the impact of this tragedy has been felt on a global basis. Out of the corner of my eye here, and I'll show it to you again, we have been watching the single message we have had from Mission Control, if we could look at it, please, from the Kennedy Space Center. It's called their video release system, and their news conference clock at the bottom simply continues to change from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, then to 4:15, then to 4:25, and it has now changed to 4:30 again. And we know, because we feel it every bit as strongly as you do, that we may sound a bit as if we're blathering on here a lot, but we are waiting, as I'm sure all of you are, to hear from NASA, and we are going to stay on the air until NASA tells us what it knows. As Lynn said, it was not one of the better pieces of news today, but one of the more helpful pieces of news at this particular moment in the flight, when the astronauts are not in control of the shuttle or the rockets. They're just riding the ride, as you've heard so many astronauts say in the past. At this particular period in the mission, there is more information available through telemetry to Mission Control than at any other time, probably, during the flight. We want to go now to Germany, to one of America's most important allies in Western Europe, where a great many American servicemen, men and women, serve the country overseas. For reaction there, here's ABC's Mike von Fremd.
Here in West Germany, passengers at the busy Frankfurt airport huddled around TV sets and expressed the same shock being felt throughout the United States.
Terrible.
What do you think it'll do for America's space program?
Oh, I personally don't think that it will change very much.
It's very, very horrible, but I think they must do it again.
The Germans feel a special understanding of this loss because late last year they were part of another shuttle launch in a joint venture with the United States. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres were holding a news conference in Bonn when they were informed of the incident. Armed Services Television broke in with live reports from the United States so that the 200,000 soldiers stationed here can follow the story. And throughout Europe, millions are following the special reports on radio and television and making known their sorrow. Mike von Fremd, ABC News, Frankfurt.
There was a day when all that would seem very far away, but in part because of the satellites which NASA lifts into space, we're all interconnected now. You can sit, as I have done, in places like West Germany and in Korea, and watch the evening newscasts, among other things, from America, virtually at the same time, though different time zones, and they are seen in America. Another dimension of America's program in space, the interconnecting of the rest of the world through the satellite communication system. 4:30 is the time we are now expecting the news conference at NASA at the Cape. This is from Launch Control. We're expecting to hear from them as they tell us from the space transportation system down there what they know, and that is why at this point we are staying on the air. Just to review a couple of things which you may not have heard earlier, the President has postponed his State of the Union message, which he was going to give at 9 o'clock this evening, for a week. That was a general sentiment, which we were told by Larry Speaks at the White House the President had initiated. It was clearly well received on Capitol Hill, and so the President's State of the Union, in which he clearly wants to talk about the budget and tax reform and the state of the nation, both at home and abroad, is going to be postponed for a week. The House of Representatives has adjourned for the remainder of the day as a mark of respect and honor to the 7 individuals who lost their lives on board Challenger this morning. Vice President Bush, at the President's command, has gone off to Cape Canaveral in Florida to, express his deep, profound personal and official sympathy to the families of those men and women on board who lost their lives, but also, as Sam Donaldson told us, to begin to, in a sense, sort of lead the White House's team to try to find out what on earth went wrong and what will be needed to rectify it so that America continue to be aggressive and competitive. As Congressman George Brown suggested, America needed to be competitive and aggressive in terms of competing with the rest of the world in the commercial aspects of space. You heard a little while ago Lynn Scherr talking about Judy Resnick, the other woman on board, the concert pianist, the mission specialist in this particular instance. Lynn Scherr, who you now know covers space so competently for us, talked to Judith Resnick back in June, and back in June of 1982, which means we've gone into our library some extent. But here is another glimpse at one of the human beings who was on this mission, no longer just a still picture.
Joining us for our coverage of the space shuttle of STS-4 is Dr. Judy Resnick. Judy is one of the newer astronauts. She is a mission specialist, her specialty being electrical engineering, but who knows what she'll do when she gets in orbit. Judy, welcome. It's nice to have you.
Thank you.
One of the things we were talking about before is once these guys get up there and on orbit, they've got a very strange working day. It's a little bit different from what it's been in the past.
Well, today they're going to take it easy. The only strange part about it is when they go to sleep and when they get up. They will get about 8 hours of sleep every night, but that will start tonight, for example, at 7:30 our time, having them get up about 3:30 in the morning.
And that changes all week until it's earlier and earlier, right?
We gradually move the wake-up time a little bit earlier so that on the landing day they have enough time to get up and get all the things done that they need to do before they deorbit to land at Edwards at 9 o'clock Pacific time.
So those of us who are following it on mission control, if we're on astronaut time, we're getting up at 12, 1, 2, 3 in the morning and going to bed around dinner time.
That's right. We're more tired than they are.
The landing also, if they don't get their crosswind, it will be the first concrete runway landing. Is that correct?
At the present time, that is the plan.
While they're on orbit, we were talking before, one of the things you have studied has been the arm, the remote manipulator system. What are they going to be doing different with the arm this time when they're up there?
Well, once again, we're going to be picking up a small instrumentation.
Led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space, There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Live from the White House in Washington, D.C., the President of the United States with a talk to the American people on this day when 7 of their fellow Americans, 7 individual and unique human beings, apparently perished in the fireball that became the Space Shuttle Challenger. Those heroes were the commander of the Space Shuttle flight today, Major Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, Auburn, Washington, hometown, married, father of 2 children. This was his 2nd mission and his first command of a shuttle mission. He is a retired major from the United States Air Force. Francis Scobie was the shuttle commander today. His pilot, riding in effect 2nd seat, Mike Smith, 40 years old, from Beaufort, North Carolina. Married, the father of 3 children. This was his first mission. He's a commander by rank in the United States Navy, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Among the other heroes aboard, Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, 36, hometown, Akron, Ohio. Unmarried. She had a doctorate in electrical engineering, was a classical pianist. This was her 2nd mission. She was the 2nd American woman in space, 2nd behind Sally Ride. This was her 2nd shuttle mission. She was trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Mission Specialist Ronald McNair, among the heroes, 35 years old, Lake City, South Carolina, his hometown. The father of 2 children, married, a doctorate in physics from MIT. This was his 2nd flight. Mission Specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii. Married, father of 2 children, an Air Force colonel. This also was his 2nd flight. His first flight was a secret one for the Defense Department some months back. Payload specialist and employee of Hughes Aircraft, connected to NASA, Greg Jarvis, 41 years old, married, made his home in Spring Valley, New York, an electrical engineer. He was bumped from 2 previous flights, but was finally getting a chance to go, and oh, how he looked forward to it. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightlessness of space. And Susan Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old social studies teacher, born in Boston, Massachusetts, high school teacher in Concord, New Hampshire, a teacher since 1970, and was selected from 11,146 teachers from all across the country who had applied to be NASA's first citizen in space. The first strictly citizen in space she was to have been. Married, her husband's an attorney, with 2 small children. She was to have taught later in the week 2 15-minute classroom lessons from space. Those, the 7 Americans who perished today aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in a ball of flame. In the California desert north of Los Angeles is the Rockwell International Facility where the Space Shuttle Challenger was put together. CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen has been there for reaction.
This is where the Challenger was built, Rockwell International in the Mojave Desert at Palmdale, California. Over the lunch hour today, the people who had put the Challenger together sat in stunned disbelief as they watched their spaceship on the videotape replays, exploding over and over again.
When the word started coming out, people were really down. Emotions were, a few people around the plant crying. People just felt really bad because of something they built, and they really were happy to see it go and stuff. And when that came around, everybody was really down about it.
And I feel sorry for all the things that happened over there, and I'd like to tell the families and everybody else how sorry we are.
Crushed very hard to understand that you work on something and have so much pride and know that it happened and that there's nothing really you can do but just the pride of knowing that you worked on it.
Sorrow, wounded pride, utter helplessness. The feelings of the space-age workers who helped the Challenger rise from the California desert. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
And now, as it happened, videotape from this morning's tragedy and explosion in space. This was the 56th manned space launch for the United States.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And the flaming debris got smaller and smaller as it rained for 45 minutes into the Atlantic Ocean just southeast of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now in slow motion videotape, the critical scenes just before and during the explosion as the orbiter shuttle rides on its own liquid fuel tank and with the solid booster rockets on the sides. The catastrophic explosion left Mission Control in Houston stunned. At a news conference this afternoon, the first official word from NASA since the disaster, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration said simply and directly it did not know what had happened. For CBS News in New York, Dan Rather with Bruce Hall, CBS News at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll have full coverage of what happened today and reaction to it on the CBS Evening News later. And shortly, coming up next, in many of these stations, your early local news. For now, good day.
This is CBS.
Resnick. It's a pretty tough program. Were you prepared for this, for the physical difficulty of it?
Well, it's not really so difficult physically. It's a lot of new things, but they lead you through it by the hand. This is a demonstration of
now, wait a minute. That doesn't look like a lot of fun for a Saturday afternoon to me. I don't know about you, but...
Well, you have to learn how to survive in case you have to get out of an airplane in a parachute, and they teach you step by step how to fall, how to be dragged. That's the impact you feel if you go through an ejection seat, and it's really not as bad as it looks. They show you how to fall into the water by, instead of letting you fall the first time, they let you slide down a slide wire. Like I say, they break you into it gradually.
Were you a tomboy when you were a kid?
No.
You weren't, and you took to this right away. You like it.
It's fun.
What's the best part about being an astronaut?
Everything.
You just like it all?
Yes.
You get to exercise your training, electrical engineering, and expand your knowledge enormously, I would think.
Yes, I think the best part technically is that it's a very well-rounded approach to science and technology, and we get to do a little bit of everything and state-of-the-art, and it's always a challenge.
What happens when you meet a man who's not in the space program and doesn't know who you are, and you say, I'm an astronaut? Does he say, yeah, you're too cute to be an astronaut. Come on, little lady, you can't be an astronaut?
I just tell him I'm an engineer.
You don't tell him you're an astronaut?
Not unless he asks.
Do you really, you mean when you meet people for the first time? What about the whole business about social relationships? Does it make it, are some men threatened by the fact that you're an astronaut?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably not my friends.
Yeah.
This is Doug Adair in the Newswatch 4 newsroom. It would take just a moment to tell you that we will have a psychologist, a child psychologist, at 5:30 tonight to talk about what possible damage is done to children by what they have seen today of the shuttle explosion. We'll be with Senator Glenn in Washington, of course, the math teacher in Akron who taught astronaut Judy Resnick, the teacher Gail Klink in Newark, who was one of the Ohio finalists in choosing a teacher to go into space. We'll talk with the OSU rocketry expert for his opinion on what has happened, and we'll be with school children in Grandview, also at Westerville North. So please join us at 5:30.
Program. They are so gifted in so many ways. A PhD in electrical engineering. She was an enthusiastic gardener. She was a classical pianist. And despite her protestations that she couldn't do things better than some of the men, all of the men told me that when she operated that big Canadian arm at the back of the payload, she had a great touch, that she had real dexterity. It may have been a result of her piano training, but at any rate, it is a great loss for everybody. We have now a schematic that we can show you that we will superimpose, as it were, over some of the pictures that we saw earlier today. These are the actual pictures, and then the schematic, as you can see, lays over so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Could we put that back up there again? Okay, fine. Anyhow, we're watching it now begin to blow up, and as you can see, the shuttle itself was on the bottom. The two solid rocket boosters were on either side, and the external tank is what appeared to come apart, although it's, I must emphasize that Jess Moore from NASA, who knows a great deal more about this than I do, refused to speculate based on those pictures. He's looked on them, he's looked at them, he's listened to all of us as we have made our observations today that it appeared to be a problem with the external tank, and he refused to get into that speculation, as well as he should not get into it, because after all, we want the best kind of investigation to go forward. Bob Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California right now. Bob, what are they saying out there about the nature of the investigation?
Well, the nature of the investigation isn't something that's being conducted here. This is the headquarters for unmanned spaceflight. However, one of the things that was interesting here is that so many of us who cover space regularly were here because of the Uranus mission of the Voyager spacecraft. And even the most veteran, hardened, experienced space reporter, there was just such a state of shock here among people who had seen so many space launches one after another to see what had happened today. When you're talking about the external fuel tank, and we're just speculating here as we have been all day long, obviously that was what exploded. The question is whether it was the first thing to explode and whether it was the thing that initiated the explosion, and I guess that's the key question, because when we do look at those pictures, there's no question that that huge barrel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, one of the most explosive combinations that human beings can put together, did go up and annihilate everything that had been left of the space shuttle. There's no question about that. The question is what initiated it. One of the things that will certainly be looked at in the investigation, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is what happened, but one of the things that will be examined in the investigation is that there are what NASA calls pyrotechnics. There are explosives on board the shuttle which are designed to blow it up. Now, there are hundreds of safety devices to keep those things from going off accidentally, but there is a man called the range safety officer whose duty it is to watch the shuttle, and in case it starts to go way off course and approach a populated area, he presses a button that would cause the shuttle to blow up. Now, those pyrotechnic devices are one of many, probably hundreds or even thousands of things that they're looking at as a possible malfunction. So, as Jess Moore said before, just from looking at that tape, all that you can see is that there was an explosion. You can't see what caused it, and it's probably going to take them an awful long time. One of the things that was interesting to me, having watched so many launches and looking at it, is that there wasn't a single indication of anything going wrong whatsoever. There was talk about the launch looking slow and everything, but if as we've done earlier in the day, if you play it back next to normal launches, in fact, it wasn't slow. It has to do with camera angles. There was talks about funny noise, but that has to do with the wind condition. It was a cold day, so it would have sounded much different to anybody who was there than it would on a normal Florida humid afternoon. There was no indication whatsoever, because if there had been, they would have radioed it to the crew. It would have been some evidence of it in the conversation. The only thing there was the permission for Dick Scobie, the commander, to go ahead to full throttle, his acknowledgement of that command, and then apparently as he just was going to full throttle, there was the explosion. So it's going to take quite an investigation to find out. At this point, there are no clues whatsoever. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who, as he indicated, he's watched a good many of those, and they are magnificent sights on takeoff, as they were today, as a matter of fact. In the original flight, I remember a man saying it's a real pant flapper. You have no sense of what it's like on takeoff, the sheer raw power of the space shuttle and its attached propellant systems, until you're there and can feel it, as you actually can, as it sweeps across the Cape, the sound and the reverberations on takeoff, and it's a sight of utter majesty. And then today, that sight of utter majesty turned into a sight of utter horror. John Palmer's in New York now with additional information on this national tragedy, which has been going on now for almost 6 hours. John Palmer.
Yes, Tom, a national tragedy. It is a very sad day, and another sad statistic. A total of 11 children now have apparently lost at least one of their parents as the result of the explosion and the downing of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a catastrophic fire that blew apart the Space Shuttle just about a minute and a half after it took off. A few minutes ago, the Associate Director of NASA and the head of the Houston Space Center, in that very brief announcement and took a few questions down at the Cape, he said that the space program, had experienced a national tragedy, and he said there was no evidence the crew had survived. It's now after sundown in that search area, about 18 miles off the coast from Cape Canaveral, and as Jess Moore told us about 45 minutes ago, they have found no evidence, no debris, and certainly no sign of any survivors whatsoever. Jess Moore announced that he has formed an interim board to investigate, to review the facts right immediately, and to impound all information, all computer data, to get ready for another more formal board that will really look into the cause to see what happened. He said he would not speculate on the cause of the explosion because he said it was just too early, and as Tom just mentioned, he said that he was not going to speculate on the basis of those tragic pictures we see of about a minute and a half into the flight, the explosion there of the space shuttle. Again, he said there were no reports of any debris recovered. He was asked if there was any pressure whatsoever to get this particular shuttle off the ground. It had been delayed several days. It was delayed again today a couple of hours because of the freezing temperatures there and because of some icicles. Its predecessor, the Columbia, had been delayed for 7 days. They had planned 15 different space shuttles throughout this year of 1986. Obviously, they're not going to make that schedule, and there was even some doubt because of the delays of the last 2 shuttles that they were going to be able to make it. Moore said that all he could say is, obviously, from his observation and from ours and from everyone's, there was an explosion. He said, for now, the space program is suspended. He said there were no unusual weather conditions whatsoever. He said they sent up the usual airplanes early in the morning. They sent up weather balloons. It has been noted, though, that the jet stream was unusually far to the south in the last 24 hours, moving down over central Florida. At about an altitude of 7 to 9 miles, the speed of the jet stream of the winds there clocked at about 100 miles an hour this morning. It was well below freezing. That doesn't mean that this perhaps had anything whatsoever to do with the tragedy that occurred, but it was a low of 25 for several hours overnight at Cape Canaveral, and that came up at about 10 o'clock in the morning to about 32 degrees, and the launch went off at 11:38 Eastern Time, the explosion following about a minute and a half later. There will be, of course, no State of the Union address tonight. The President, addressing the nation a short while ago from the Oval Office, stated, of course, that he wanted to come and talk about the state of the nation, but because of the tragedy, he said he was pained to the core, he and Mrs. Reagan pained to the core, that this was a day of national mourning. He said of the astronauts, they had a hunger to explore the universe. And, of course, he had those comments, those very poignant, very sad comments to the school children, literally thousands of school kids all across this country were waiting in their classrooms to see this liftoff because the teacher, Christy McAuliffe, was taking off and was going to give exactly 2, I think it was, lessons from outer space. That's the situation now, kind of a wrap-up to the point. Again, it's after dark, and we couldn't expect really many more developments out of that search area. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
Thank you very much, John Palmer. All manner of little tidbits of information coming our way. Governor Bob Graham, the governor of Florida, who has witnessed a number of those shuttle launches, was on a campaign tour today announcing his candidacy for the Senate, and he saw the takeoff and then the explosion from his airplane as he was flying over Florida. And about the president's message to the school children of America, it's very easy for those of us who are grown-ups to be kind of jaded about the space program. I recall vividly a friend of mine, a grown-up, who was watching a launch of a shuttle and turned to his wife and said, "Oh, it's another boring space launch," when his son, who was about 12 years old at the time, turned to him and said, "Hey, that's my future that you're talking about." And that's what the administration obviously had hoped would be an important part of this mission, that the youngsters of this country would think about that as their future. And nowhere was there more attention being paid to this shuttle launch today than in Concord, New Hampshire, the home of Christy McAuliffe. She was a school teacher there of third graders, but these were high school kids watching from an auditorium. The unalloyed joy of high school students with a kind of unofficial holiday as they watched what appeared to be the successful takeoff of the Challenger with Christy McAuliffe on board. And then the realization that something terrible was wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time? We're asking all students to leave.
The best and worst, of course, of live television coverage coming together there in that auditorium as we were all able to watch what happened to what turned out to be their friend and then 6 other people that we cared about as a nation, the astronauts, as the shuttle blew up. And we were all suspended for a time between a state of belief and disbelief, not quite sure what we were seeing could in fact happen, because we have come to expect so much from high technology. But then the slow realization that in fact that our worst fears now were being realized. I will tell you that as a journalist who's covered the space program for a long time, that's been at the back of the mind of a lot of us. Maybe one of these will blow up on the pad or blow up in the sky someday, and we have to watch it, but we always kind of put it at the back of our mind, never quite believing that it would happen. The astronauts who were involved in today's flight were interviewed before they went off about their feelings and their thoughts. Most of them, of course, not expressing fears because they're not built that way, frankly. Here's what some of them had to say about what lay ahead, they thought.
Dr. McNair, first of all, this is your second flight. Can you give us any perspective on what it's been like for you training this time as opposed to last time, or your sense of anticipation this time as opposed to last time?
Well, starting with my sense of anticipation, I would say it's greater this time than the first, simply because I know how great it is, how nice it is, and how much fun it is, and how fascinating the entire experience is. Training the second time around, I would have to say, is a little easier. A lot of it you've done already. It's a matter of refreshing. I do have some new payloads that I have to start at ground zero with and learn, but having done it really has its advantages. But I do look forward to this, and it's as challenging. One cannot get lax about it, approach it with the same amount of caution as the first or any time, but overall it's not as taxing.
Well, Mr. Jarvis, you are finally going to get to go up. It must, in addition to the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of things for your company, you must be, as an individual, be fairly charged up at this point.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
Well, what do you look forward to after this, Colonel? You've got a couple of flights. You'll have a couple of flights under your belt after you get back from this one. What's your goal?
Well, I hope to stay with the space program, certainly fly more missions. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I expect to stay with the program. Looking forward, like I said, to more missions and some involvement to future programs downstream. So I enjoy the space program. I'm very intrigued by the challenge it offers, and I look forward to staying with it as long as I can.
Coming up next on Newswatch 4 Columbus at 5:30, a psychologist talks about helping our children deal with the shuttle explosion.
We want you to know that we will rejoin the network whenever anything important happens that you need to know about. We'll be in Washington via satellite with Senator John Glenn, a teacher in Newark who might have been on the Challenger today, and of course Jim Ganal, Jimmy Cromit signed up to be the first journalists in space. We'll be getting their reaction.
And 5:30 is live from Otterbein College tonight. What never happened did happen today, and a lot of Central Ohioans can't believe it. Tonight we'll have the full reaction to the tragedy today. Be sure to stay with us.
It was a clear blue sky at Cape Canaveral this morning. Thousands had gathered to watch the historic launch. This was the first mission to carry a civilian in space, Krista McAuliffe, a teacher from New Hampshire. Also on board, 6 others, including Ohio native Judith Resnick, who grew up in Akron. After so many delays, the countdown was finally underway.
Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Finally, liftoff, 11:38. McAuliffe's parents and some of her school children were huddled below in a special VIP section. It looked so good. The broad white plume of the shuttle billowed into the atmosphere. But then, just 1 minute later, just after the astronauts were told to go full throttle, an incredible blast, an explosion and fireball so immense that it splintered the shuttle into fragments that showered the Atlantic below for the next 45 minutes. On the ground, disbelief, uncertainty, and confusion.
Downrange. Have flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Ironically, it was just a few days ago that McAuliffe's husband, Steve, told ABC that his wife was fully aware of the dangers involved, and yet she was thrilled with the prospect of going.
Has she been disappointed at all by the disappointments of the Space Shuttle Challenger, or Columbia, that there was frequent delays in taking off, and then there was a difficulty in landing? Is she concerned about that?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think we've always looked at that as proof positive that they don't launch them unless it's absolutely perfect, and if there's anything the slightest bit out of order, they wait and correct.
NASA still does not know exactly what happened, but it notes this afternoon this is the first in-flight disaster in 56 missions.
Of course, this may be the only in-flight disaster, but we must also note that back in 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee all died when their spacecraft caught fire on the launch pad. One of the astronauts, the second woman in space, hails from our state of Ohio. Judith Resnick is a native of Akron. The 36-year-old grew up in that northern Ohio city. Resnick also has relatives here in central Ohio as well. After working for RCA and Xerox, the electrical engineer joined the NASA space program in 1978. Resnick's specialty was the shuttle's mechanical arm. In this interview in 1982, Resnick talked to ABC News about that mechanical arm.
Last week in Florida to witness the launch of the Challenger with their friend and fellow teacher aboard. But after repeated delays, Gail Klink returned home to Newark last night.
Right now, I'm sorry that I didn't stay the extra day because I feel like we need to be with each other right now.
Understandably, today's tragedy left Gail Klink shaken. But never for a moment did she question the wisdom of her motivation or that of Krista McAuliffe.
I don't think Krista's life was any more tragic a loss than the other people on the crew. They all knew what they were doing when they went on board. I think people will still apply to go. I still would be willing to go.
Gail Klink will remain a NASA space ambassador. She's already given 64 presentations on the space program.
I still claim it's the safest vehicle on land, sea, or air, and its record is better than most vehicles. I hope, and I'm sure Krista would say this too, that this doesn't stop the space program. The benefits are so overwhelming.
When Gail Klink returns to teaching Spanish and English here at Newark High School, she'll tell her students that while she has lost a friend in Krista McAuliffe, she has not lost her faith in the value of the space program. Ted Hart, Action 6 News.
Of course, it was Krista McAuliffe and not Gail Klink that NASA actually selected. McAuliffe quickly became the focal point of this mission, and the entire country watched as a teacher from New Concord, New Hampshire, prepared to fulfill a dream.
When she left her classroom behind for a semester of space training, 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe temporarily traded 12 years of teaching for a new kind of learning. Listen to her description of the airplane ride that simulates zero gravity.
As you peak that parabola at the top, you have about 20 or 30 seconds of weightlessness, and all of a sudden, just like Peter Pan, you start flying up, and it was just unbelievable.
That's the enthusiasm that's made her a favorite of students at Concord High School in New Hampshire. This is where the Boston-born social studies teacher lives with her husband and 2 children, and where she put together her winning lesson plan.
She can take very complex concepts and simplify them, but not water them down, and she makes all her students understand things, but in an interesting manner.
That's also what helped her application stand out among the 11,000 NASA received, and what changed her life.
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe.
Suddenly, she was a celebrity. McAuliffe and her family were paraded along Main Street and featured on the front page. When she reported to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, she was poked and prodded and outfitted and observed.
She's a sort of a risk taker. She does the unusual, the way she runs a class, and she's not afraid of things. She lives life. She's not afraid of it.
Lynn Scher, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
Well, today's tragic events certainly have had a terrible impact on all of us, of course.
We will continue our coverage of the NASA tragedy in a moment with the reaction of a Columbus area boy who wants to be aboard a future shuttle.
Disbelief, a common reaction by students when they first heard. A library television brought the tragedy into reality.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Then when I saw it, I realized how serious it was and how really close to home it did hit with Dave and everything. And I just started realizing how really serious it was. And I felt really bad for Dave. And it's weird to think that it could have been him, and we're lucky that it wasn't, but we're really sorry for the people that did die in it.
I was kind of shocked at first, and then I went in, watched the TV, and watched it on live TV, and it was true. Everybody was really shocked. It was silent in there, and I don't think anybody believed it would happen at first, after all the successful missions it had earlier.
Wayner had dreamed of making this flight. He also had met Krista McAuliffe.
It looked like a very normal launch, and up until about 2 minutes, it had fired, and 2 minutes later they were getting ready for this solid booster separation. And
Tragedy in the skies over Florida today, a scene which will probably be etched in all our memories. And in Westerville, Ohio, Dave Wayner's classes would not return to normal.
I guess about the main thing is that we learn together.
You know, after all this, Dave, would you still want to go up?
Yes, I would.
Shuttle?
Yes, I would.
No doubts about it?
Nope.
Program has to go on?
Yeah.
Even though you lose life and everything?
You gotta get back on top of the horse after you get thrown off.
Well, disbelief by a lot of people, but few of the kids that I talked to today said they wanted the shuttle program discontinued because of the tragedy today. And right now, Otterbein students were eating dinner but gathering around the TV to get an update on the shuttle situation. And, you know, as we heard NASA talk today, they doubt anybody survived that.
Yeah. And Larry, most of the people that were going to fly or hope to fly someday, it doesn't seem to have changed anything for them. We'll be asking Jim Ganal and Jim Crum later if this changes their feelings about wanting to fly.
And a tragedy on the ground today in Coshocton County. An oil...
It surprised me.
Steve says even he will be surprised if NASA chooses him, but he had to try.
When I was little, I used to watch the Apollo missions and the Soyuz docking and all that, and a chance to go up in space would be a thrill for me. So I decided it was worth taking a chance, even if I I figure my chances are 2, slim and none. But just to go through the experience is worth it.
But worth it now that the unfathomable has happened?
And I definitely would be scared to death to go up there, but I don't think it would keep me from going if I somehow got selected.
Good luck, Steve. This is Carol Rapp, Action 6 News.
State Superintendent of Public Instruction Franklin Walter is asking all Ohioans to leave a light on outside their homes tonight in memory of teacher Krista McAuliffe. With tears in his eyes, Walter expressed shock and sorrow this afternoon. At the time of the explosion, Walter was holding a meeting here in Columbus with Ohio's large city superintendents. A message was brought to the group of educators, and they immediately turned on a television for more information.
Let the memory of the first teacher in space cause all members of the education family, teachers, students, parents, and other citizens to rededicate themselves to emulating McAuliffe's high ideals and goals.
Walter also said his feelings go out to the families of the entire 7-member crew. Ohio's U.S. Senator John Glenn, of course, has a unique perspective on this national tragedy. As one of the original 7 astronauts, Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. He knows firsthand NASA's concern for the safety of the crew.
There's one thing NASA has not done all the way through. It is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. It's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago.
Senator Glenn also said he'd go back into space in a moment. Reaction from people in Columbus ranged from shock to disbelief to anguish. During the noon hour today, drivers pulled their cars off the road and headed for local television stores, and people watched.
Many times we've seen that. Here's the close-up, and there is the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger happening about 11:39 Eastern Time, and you see now what appears to be...
Well, there was a lot of disbelief at first. I think people really didn't know quite what was going on. After that, there was just a lot of silence. People watching the TV, not really knowing what's going on.
The shock, and the students were sent back to class. Brian Ballard was in that class. He's the editor of the school newspaper. And a few weeks ago, when he was asked if he'd like to go into space, he said, yes, I'd be nervous. Well, today, when asked the same question, he said, I'd have to think more about it. I'd be afraid now instead of just nervous. Karen Agan is a school psychologist here in the Columbus area, and fear is what most children are probably experiencing tonight. We adults are not quite ourselves either. It's such a shocking thing. But when a little one sees something like this happen on television, it's not like Star Wars. People don't come back alive because they're actors and actresses. It's real. How do we help them?
I think it's very real to the children, and I think that we need to address it with them. I do think we need to talk to them to deal with both the cognitive and to deal with the emotional element in dealing with this. I think cognitively they were probably pretty well informed in their own schools today. There are a lot of questions that they will have about the technical kinds of things, and I think the schools would probably best deal with that. As far as the feeling component goes, I do think that we need to address our own feelings and those of our children. I'm concerned that a parent would engage in reflective communication with their child. It's okay to feel disappointment, a sense of loss, a sense of sadness in regards to all of this. And I think that if you see a child who is upset or perhaps verbalizing concern, just labeling that feeling, saying, Mommy is sad, Mommy feels a sense of loss, or do you feel sad? You know, you're not really angry, you're not really upset, you're sad about all of this, and it's okay to work that out.
Is there any kind of behavior we should look for that might be a danger sign that this is affecting our child a little too much?
I think most children will react to it within the next couple of days, and that is certainly appropriate behavior. I would be somewhat watchful for a child who would have ongoing behaviors that might be escalated, maybe a change in behavior, erratic behaviors that you haven't seen before, sleeplessness.
Nightmares?
Nightmares is a possibility, maybe an unusual fascination with the whole space situation, etc. I think that, you know, the kids need to deal with it, and that's a very normal reaction, but anything that would be out of the ordinary, I would very much like to see that, you know, a parent would deal with it as much as they feel capable, and then hopefully utilize their school psychologists or mental health professionals in the field to...
Nice to know you school psychologists are out there.
Thank
you
you.
are with the Upper Arlington School System?
Yes, I am.
We thank you for being
Thank
with
you.
us, Karen. Through all her training, Krista McAuliffe's husband, Stephen, and their children, Scott and Caroline, Krista said recently that 9-year-old Scott understood what she was doing, but that 6-year-old Caroline called occasionally to ask, Mom, are you in space yet? The State Superintendent of Schools has asked us all tonight to help honor Krista.
Also have had 6 years as the teacher type of program, and obviously we're extremely sad. I think it rivals the shooting of John Kennedy for most of us.
Everybody remember where I was today when I heard. How about how you feel now about going into space? You still want to do it?
I still would do it. It's still, you realize that it's a calculated risk. But I think right off the top of your head, it's like Jim said, I think the last time I sat in front of a television set and cried was when Mr. Kennedy was assassinated. And I did the same thing today. I didn't know any of these people, but I felt, I think as Jim did, that we'd lost a good friend.
7 such courageous people. There's a reason that journalists and teachers are involved in this program.
After the program becomes routine, because you've had 24 flights that go without any hitches, you need to keep the interest up, and that is why journalists and teachers and senators and congressmen are chosen, to keep the interest up in that program, and that is why this is done this way. But I think it's going to be a very long time now before they will allow citizens like us to go into space.
I think they're now estimating that it may be 12 to 18 months before we put another mission in space.
And NASA's always been so conservative and criticized for it, for being so careful and so sure. That criticism will not come for long.
Safety is their first priority. Always has been, and I think always will be. More so now than ever before.
The thing that hits home with me on this is that Krista McAuliffe also had a 5-year-old daughter who said, Mommy, I don't want you to go into space. I want you to stay home. And when we were watching it, I was watching it with my 5-year-old daughter today, and she voiced the same concerns to me. So I would think very hard before doing this, I think. But I still, that's a dream I'd like to go.
There are understandable concerns by everyone now in your family, especially after being chosen for the Challenger mission. Krista McAuliffe told reporters and fellow teachers that space exploration is not just for astronauts, but it is the future of every child. She put it this way: if we don't prepare kids for the future, we are not doing our jobs as teachers. State Superintendent Franklin Walter has asked us all to turn on our porch lights tonight in her memory and in her honor. And we'll be back.
It doesn't matter who wins or who loses. You know, the sun comes up tomorrow. But we do have one event here in town we want to have to talk about. It is baseball. The Cincinnati Reds traveling caravan is here. Pete Rose and a number of other players are out at the Highlight restaurant. Mike Rada is there as well. And Mike, who grew up in Cincinnati, I know must love all the talk that's going on right now, talking about, well, how the Reds are going to win the pennant. Everybody can talk about it.
Let's go back to Larry at Otterbein College for some reaction from college students.
Well, first, I'm going to talk about kind of my own reaction today. You know, Mona, all of us have sat in the studio in the newsroom and watched all the monitors, feeds from all over and all the different angles of the tragedy today. And you know, the hardest thing for me, even after seeing the explosion itself, was looking at her husband who had to witness that. I think that was the most dramatic thing I saw, just the stunned look on his face, and then the shock of it, you know, when he realized what had actually occurred. Now, we've had all afternoon to really absorb this tragedy today. I'm here with the students. Your name first?
Susie Walsh.
Well, Susie, now you have had the day to think about it. You saw it on TV. What's your mood now? What are you thinking about when it comes to the shuttle?
Well, I thought it was a horrible tragedy and everything, and I was really upset that everyone, this happened to everyone, but I was thinking that I hope it doesn't hinder any of the further advancement in space.
You wanted to go on. Your name?
Lisa Ferryman.
Lisa, it's the same question to you. How do you feel about it now?
I was really upset, and I still really am. It bugs me to think that those people died.
Why does it bug you so? Isn't that a fact of life about
Well,
space travel?
Yeah, I realize that, but it's still sad for me.
Over here, your name.
My name's Bart.
Bart, go ahead. Same question. Your reaction to the space shuttle tragedy?
It was tragic, and it came rather unexpected. I didn't...
Should they go on with space travel, with the space shuttle program?
I think they should. I think that those people should be, you know, honored, though, for their commitment and, you know, what happened, what they gave for the program.
And you, your name?
Jill McKeever.
Jill, your reaction?
Well, I thought it was terrible, especially the fact that there were civilians on board, and that I don't think it should interfere with the advancement.
Did you believe it happened today? When you heard the news, what was your first reaction?
At first, I didn't believe it. I thought maybe it was, I don't know, I didn't believe it.
You know, Mona, I think that was such a common reaction of people. You know, you heard it over the radio, or maybe you caught that spot bulletin on television, and maybe it did take the visuals, the actual scene of it on TV, to realize that those people probably did not survive. I qualify that because, you know, we don't know for certain, but it certainly looked as though they perished.
No, watching it as we did over and over and over as we have all day, you can't imagine anyone could live through that. I heard something very moving on WBBY radio. One of the announcers said, Krista McAuliffe had said, I want to see Earth from a different perspective as a history teacher, as a historian, and he said she will see Earth from a different perspective, not the one she had planned on.
No.
We'll be back.